Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we step into a wind-battered medieval harbour inn, where winter is not just a season, but a living force pressing against every wooden beam and stone wall. You are arriving right at the moment the sea turns restless. When gulls vanish and even the bravest sailors walk a little faster towards shelter. Outside, waves slam into the harbour like heavy fists, and inside, a single hearth tries its best to pretend the world is still manageable. And honestly, you probably won't survive this kind of coastal winter without a warm fire and a thick cloak. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your world right now, because somewhere out there it is night, somewhere it is morning, and in this inn time feels a little less certain. Now, dim the lights and let yourself be carried straight into the story. You step onto slick wooden planks at the edge of a medieval harbour, where salt clings to everything like an old memory that refuses to fade. The inn rises just ahead of you, half leaning into the wind as if it has learned to brace itself over decades of storms. Lantern light flickers in its windows, trembling like it is unsure whether it should stay lit or surrender to the gusts. The air tastes of iron and sea spray. You can feel it in your teeth, sharp and cold, as you move closer. Somewhere beneath the roar of the waves, ropes creak against mooring posts, a sound like tired giants pulling at their chains. In this world, harbour inns are lifelines in many European trading ports during the High Medieval period, especially places connected to busy maritime routes like the North Sea and Baltic corridors. Inns near docks served as both shelter and informal trade hubs. Merchants, sailors, and travellers depended on them not just for rest, but for news, work, and survival. A common historical detail from this era is how tightly woven trade and lodging were. Inns often doubled as places where contracts were whispered over ale, and cargo deals were settled before dawn. Ships might not even unload fully before word reached the innkeeper about who was looking for passage, who needed cargo moved, and who had not been paid. It was a world where sleep and commerce shared the same smoky room. You push forward, boots slipping slightly on wet timber, and the inn door finally comes into view. It is thick oak, darkened by years of salt air and hands pressing against it. The wind behind you seems almost personal now, like it is trying to push you back out to sea, but you reach the door anyway, and for a moment your hand rests on the iron latch. Cold enough to sting, inside warmth waits. The instant you step through, the world changes texture, sound softens. The roar of the harbour becomes distant, like a memory rather than a reality. Heat wraps around your face, carrying the smell of burning wood, spiced ale, and damp wool drying too close to the fire. The floor is scattered with rushes, dried reeds that crunch faintly underfoot. In some regions, inn floors were regularly covered with these rushes to absorb moisture and waste, a detail that feels strangely intimate when you imagine it under your steps. Some quirky accounts even suggest that herbs were mixed into mask odours, a small attempt at dignity in a crowded living space. You notice, almost immediately, how every gaze shifts toward you for half a breath. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just observant. In a harbour inn, every newcomer is a question mark. A sailor with no ship is a story waiting to be told. A traveller without luggage might be a problem or an opportunity. Then, just as quickly, attention returns to bowls, dice, and low conversation. A mainstream historical reality settles in here too. Medieval harbour inns were often crowded beyond comfort during winter months, especially when storms delayed ships for days or even weeks. People slept wherever space allowed, sometimes sharing benches or even floor space near the hearth. Privacy, as you understand it, is not part of the architecture. You take a few steps deeper inside, and the fire reveals itself properly now, a wide stone hearth dominating the centre of the room. Flames rise and collapse in slow rhythm, like breathing. Around it, faces glow orange and gold, sailors with weather-cracked skin, merchants wrapped in thick cloaks, and a few pilgrims who look like they have forgotten how far they have come. A quirky superstition drifts through your mind as you watch them. In some coastal communities, sailors believed certain harbour inns were protected by luck spirits or even sea-bound omens, small invisible forces that decided whether a voyage would succeed. Others swore that inns near dangerous waters could hear the ocean better than churches could hear prayer. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were genuine spiritual systems or simply emotional coping mechanisms for lives spent at the mercy of tides. A gust of laughter breaks from a nearby table, pulling you back to the present. A dice game is underway, coins clinking softly, accompanied by the low hum of bargaining. No one raises their voice too high. In places like this, noise is currency, and silence is sometimes more valuable. You begin to understand the rhythm of the inn is not chaos. It is controlled survival. And yet, beneath it all, there is something else. A tension that sits just under the warmth, like the ocean itself is pressing against the walls, reminding everyone that wood and stone are only temporary agreements with nature. The innkeeper watches from behind a long counter carved smooth by years of use. They do not rush toward you. In fact, nothing here rushes. Even urgency seems to have learned patience in this place. A ledger lies open beside them, ink smudged by damp air, names, dates, debts, life reduced to careful lines. You realise then that this harbour inn is more than shelter. It is a pause between worlds, between sea and land, between departure and return, between what was lost and what might still be found. As you stand there, still adjusting to the warmth, a thought drifts in like smoke curling toward the ceiling. Historians still argue whether harbour inns like this were primarily safe resting places for travellers, or whether they functioned as unofficial centres of control where information, goods, and people were quietly monitored by those who ran coastal towns. Outside, another wave crashes harder than the last, and for a brief moment the entire building shivers in response, not fear, more like recognition. You're inside now, but the sea has not let go. The door swings fully behind you, and the storm outside becomes something you can no longer touch, only remember through vibration in the walls. Inside, the air is thicker, warmer, almost syrupy with smoke and bodies and damp wool drying too close to flame. Your first breath in here feels different, like your lungs are learning a new language after the sea's harsh grammar. You take another step forward, and the floorboards answer with a soft groan. It is not an empty building, it is a living one. Every plank, every beam, every hanging hook seems to carry weight from years of use above you. Rafters stretch low and uneven, darkened by soot that has settled like a second skin. The room is larger than it first appeared from outside. That is always the way with medieval harbour inns. From the street they look compact, defensive, almost modest. Inside, they unfold like hidden pockets of survival. In many European port towns during the Middle Ages, especially those tied into bustling trade networks like the Hanseatic League, inns near harbours were designed to compress as many functions as possible into a single structure. Sleeping, eating, bargaining, waiting, and sometimes even small-scale trade all shared the same air. You move deeper in, and the change in attention is subtle but noticeable. People do not stare anymore, but you are still measured. A sailor at the nearest table glances at your boots, noting how wet they are. A merchant adjusts his posture, as if deciding whether you are someone worth remembering in this world. Observation is a survival habit. The warmth grows stronger as you approach the hearth. It is not just heat, it is presence. The fire is large, built from heavy stone and iron supports, burning logs thick as a man's thigh. Sparks rise and vanish into the smoke-dark ceiling. Around it, people orbit in loose circles, drifting closer or further depending on conversation, drink, or exhaustion. You notice benches arranged in irregular arcs, some carved, some simply long planks placed on barrels. Nothing here is standardized. Everything is adapted. Medieval inns, especially in busy coastal regions, were rarely designed with comfort in mind. They were designed for turnover, for volume, for survival. Yet somehow, in that improvisation, a strange kind of community forms. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness as you watch a server move between tables carrying a jug of ale. In many medieval port towns, ale was safer to drink than water because the brewing process reduced harmful bacteria. That meant inns were not just places of rest, but essential hydration points for travellers and locals alike. You can almost imagine how that shaped the rhythm of conversation here, how drinking was not indulgence, but necessity. You edge closer to the fire, feeling your damp cloak begin to steam faintly. The smell of salt slowly gives way to roasted grain, wood smoke, and something faintly herbal. Someone has thrown dried plants into the fire, likely juniper or rosemary, a common practice in certain regions to mask the scent of crowded living spaces. There is a quirky belief attached to that too. In some coastal communities, it was thought that burning specific herbs could confuse bad winds, as if scent alone could negotiate with storms. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic ritual or practical fumigation disguised as superstition. A man shifts on a bench near you, making space without looking directly at you. That small gesture feels more meaningful than words. You sit, and the wood beneath you is warm from previous bodies. It is never truly cold here, even when empty. This place remembers heat. Conversation rises and falls like tide water. You catch fragments. A shipment delayed. A mast snapped somewhere north. A rumour of a ship that never entered harbour but was seen from shore, still lit at night, drifting without crew. Stories in places like this are rarely verified, but they are always repeated. Information in a harbour inn travels faster than ships, even if it is less reliable. You notice something else now. The room has no fixed centre of authority. The innkeeper is important, yes, but not dominant. Authority here is distributed, subtle, negotiated moment by moment. A loud voice can temporarily become the centre. A merchant with coin can bend attention. A sailor with a new story can hold silence for minutes at a time. This is where another historical layer reveals itself. Inns in medieval Europe often functioned as unofficial information hubs, especially in trading ports. News about weather, political tensions, and shipping routes circulated through these rooms long before it reached official records. Some historians suggest that in certain regions, particularly along the North Sea trade routes, inns were as important as guild halls for spreading economic intelligence. Others argue this influence is exaggerated and that most inn talk was unreliable gossip that rarely shaped real decisions. Still, as you listen, you can feel how information changes shape as it passes from mouth to mouth. It becomes softer, more dramatic, less precise but more emotionally charged. Truth here is not a fixed object, it is something warmed by repetition. A nearby table erupts in low laughter, and you glance over in time to see coins being gathered into a rough pile. A game has ended, or perhaps a deal has concluded, in this place. Those two things often overlap. You think about how easily a stranger could misunderstand the difference. Above you, smoke curls into the rafters and disappears into darkness. The ceiling is low enough that heat gathers and lingers, creating layers of temperature. Feet are cold, shoulders are warm, faces glow. It feels like you are sitting inside a gradient of survival. A quirky detail surfaces in your thoughts as you observe the seating arrangements. In many medieval inns, shared sleeping and seating spaces led to an informal etiquette of proximity. Strangers often had to share benches, and sometimes even beds, especially during peak travel seasons. There are accounts suggesting that travellers would sleep head to toe to maximise space. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were universally accepted or only tolerated during extreme overcrowding. You shift slightly, feeling the rhythm of the inn settle into you. It is not quiet, but it is predictable in its noise, the crackle of fire, the scrape of chairs, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter that rises and dissolves without consequence, somewhere deeper in the room. A door opens and closes, letting in a brief pulse of colder air. You do not need to turn to know what it is. Someone arriving, someone leaving. The cycle continues without pause. You begin to understand that this place is not just shelter from the storm. It is a machine for absorbing uncertainty. Every traveller brings disorder. The inn processes it into stories, meals, warmth, and temporary belonging. And yet, even in this comfort, there is an undercurrent, a reminder that the sea is never truly outside the system. It is always present, like a heartbeat just beyond hearing. Every person here is either waiting for it or recovering from it or preparing to return to it. You lean back slightly, letting the heat press into your coat. For a moment, it is easy to forget the storm completely, but the building does not let you forget for long. A distant creak runs through the beams, as if the inn itself is adjusting its stance against the wind. You realise then that you are not simply inside a building, you are inside a negotiation between wood, fire and ocean, and outside, the sea is still speaking. The warmth of the hearth still clings to you as you remain near the fire. But now a different kind of presence approaches, cutting through the noise without raising its voice. You notice it before you see it, a subtle shift in how people angle their bodies. Conversations do not stop, but they soften at the edges, like cloth pulled slightly tighter from behind the long wooden counter. The innkeeper moves. There is nothing hurried about them. In fact, their calm feels almost deliberate, like it has been practiced for years in rooms exactly like this one, under exactly these kinds of storms. You watch as they place a hand on a ledger, then close it with a quiet care, as though sealing away one world before opening another. When they finally look up at you, it is not surprise you see, it is assessment. Not cold, not warm, simply practiced attention. In a medieval harbour inn, especially those in busy trading towns along coasts of northern Europe, innkeepers were not just hosts, they were managers of risk. They tracked arrivals, departures, debts, and rumours with equal seriousness. A mainstream historical fact is that many such inns were regulated by local guild systems or town authorities, meaning the innkeeper often had to maintain records for taxation and trade oversight. Hospitality was never separate from administration. You take a step closer, feeling the heat of the fire recede slightly behind you, replaced by the cooler air nearer the counter. The innkeeper's space feels different, more ordered, less chaotic here. Even the scratches in the wood seem intentional. They gesture slightly, not quite inviting you forward, not quite instructing you to wait. Somewhere between the two, you approach. Up close, you notice details that were invisible from the firelight. Ink stains on their fingers, a faint scent of salt mixed with dried herbs on their sleeves. The fabric of their clothing is worn but clean, patched in places where storms and years have done their work. Nothing here is wasted, even wear is accounted for. The innkeeper speaks, but not loudly. Voices do not need to carry far in a room like this. Words travel differently when everyone is already listening for them. You catch fragments first, a question about shelter, a glance toward the storm outside, a brief pause as they look you over again. This time less as a stranger and more as a temporary responsibility. You nod, and that seems to be enough. They reach below the counter and produce a small tag of wood. carved roughly into a rectangle with faint markings burned into its surface. This is not unusual in many medieval inns, especially those dealing with high traffic from ports. Tokens or tally sticks were used to record lodging and payment. Another mainstream detail from historical records is that written contracts were sometimes replaced by physical tokens to simplify transactions in multilingual trade environments. You accept it, feeling its weight more in meaning than in wood. A quirky detail comes to mind as you turn it over. In some coastal regions, inns were known to mark guests with symbols rather than names when record-keeping was informal. These marks might represent payment status, length of stay, or even reputation. Some accounts suggest that certain inns developed near-secret symbol systems shared only between innkeepers and local traders. Historians still argue whether these systems were standardized or simply improvised local practices that later became romanticized in storytelling. Behind the counter, the innkeeper moves with practiced efficiency, already shifting attention to another matter. A bowl is passed to a server, a candle is adjusted, a note is added to the ledger. Nothing pauses for long, everything flows. You realize that this role is not just hospitality, it is constant triage of human movement. The innkeeper looks up again, briefly, as if confirming something unspoken. Then they gesture toward a darker corridor to one side of the room. Upstairs, sleeping space. The direction is simple, but it carries weight. Above the noise, above the fire, above the shared breathing of the room. There are rooms where the world becomes slightly more private, not fully private. Never fully private in places like this, but less shared. As you turn slightly to follow the gesture, you notice something else. The innkeeper's eyes flick briefly toward the door again, where the storm continues to press against the building. There is familiarity in that glance, not fear, recognition. You follow the line of sight for a moment and realize how often they must watch that door. Every arrival is a possibility. Every departure is a calculation. Another mainstream historical fact settles in here. Harbour inns often functioned as critical points in maritime logistics networks. They were not just places to sleep, but nodes where information about ships, cargo, and weather conditions was exchanged. In some port towns, especially those involved in long-distance trade routes, innkeepers could influence which ships received priority for lodging, supplies, or even crew recommendations. You turn back, and the innkeeper is already moving on to the next interaction. There is no lingering ceremony, only continuity. As you step away from the counter, you become more aware of the room again. The fire's crackle returns to the foreground. The murmur of conversation rises and falls like distant surf. Someone laughs briefly, then coughs into their sleeve. A chair scrapes against wood with a tired sound. You notice a small cluster of dried herbs hanging above the counter, likely rosemary or mugwort, bundled and tied. In medieval coastal regions, herbs were often used in inns not only for cooking but for masking odours and, according to some beliefs, for warding off illness or misfortune. A quirky tidbit from surviving folklore suggests that certain inns believed hanging specific herb bundles near entryways could calm restless winds. A symbolic act meant to bring peace to storm-bound travellers. Whether this was practical hygiene or ritual symbolism is still debated among historians. You move slightly to one side, giving space to a passing server carrying a tray. The rhythm of service here is continuous but not frantic. Every movement feels absorbed into a larger pattern that has been practiced for generations. The innkeeper's voice rises once more, this time addressing someone else near the fire. You do not catch the full exchange, only tone, firm but not harsh, familiar but not personal. It strikes you that authority here is not enforced through volume, but through recognition. People respond because they understand the system, not because it is shouted at them. You glance back toward the counter again, and for a moment the innkeeper is watching the room rather than any individual. It is a wide, scanning attention, like someone reading a map that is constantly changing. This is where another layer of uncertainty emerges. Historians still argue whether innkeepers in medieval harbour towns were primarily independent operators, or whether many were quietly connected to merchant guilds or local authorities who used inns as informal monitoring stations for trade and travel activity. There is no single answer. Only patterns that suggest both autonomy and oversight coexisting in uneasy balance. You feel that balance in the room itself. Freedom within structure. Warmth within risk. Noise within order. The innkeeper finally turns away again, disappearing briefly into a side space behind the counter. You catch only the movement of their silhouette, the sound of a cupboard opening, the soft clink of something being placed down. You're left standing near the transition between firelight and corridor shadow, holding your wooden token, aware that you have been quietly assigned a place within this system, even if only temporarily, above you. The ceiling beams creak as another gust of wind presses against the inn. The building responds with a low, steady sound, like a long breath held and released, and for the first time since entering, you notice that the inn does not feel like a shelter that blocks the storm. It feels like a structure that negotiates with it. You drift away from the counter's quiet authority and return toward the heart of the room, where the fire continues its steady negotiation with the winter outside. The heat is stronger here, almost enveloping, as if the inn itself is breathing warmth outward in measured pulses. You settle into a space near the hearth, where the light softens every edge of the world and turns faces into moving silhouettes of amber and shadow. Around you, life continues in layered rhythm. A man leans forward to stir his drink. A woman tightens her cloak without looking up. Someone laughs too quickly, as if trying to outrun exhaustion. Nothing is still, but nothing feels chaotic either. It is a practiced disorder, the kind that only develops in places where weather dictates human behaviour more than clocks ever could. You notice how the fire dominates everything. It is not just heat, it is authority. It decides where people sit, how long they stay awake, and even how conversations begin and end. Those closest to it speak softly. Almost reverently, those farther away lean in as if trying to borrow warmth through attention alone. One well-recorded aspect of medieval harbour life is how central the hearth was not only for comfort but for survival during winter months. In many northern trading ports, communal fires inside inns and guild halls were essential for preventing illness and maintaining morale during long storms that could trap entire populations indoors for days. Without them, coastal settlements would have struggled to function at all. You shift slightly on the bench, feeling the heat seep into the dampness of your clothing. Steam rises faintly from your sleeves, dissolving into the smoky air above. The smell is a mixture of oak wood, salt residue, and something faintly sweet from whatever herbs have been thrown into the flames. It is not clean, but it is comforting in a strange, grounded way. Nearby, a group of travellers adjust their seating to make room for a newcomer. There is no formal greeting, only a subtle rearrangement of bodies and belongings. Space here is negotiated constantly. Personal boundaries are flexible, shaped by necessity rather than preference. An odd detail preserved in coastal folklore tells of inns where the central fire was believed to choose its guests by how close they were allowed to sit without being pushed away by circumstance. In some communities, this idea was not literal but symbolic, representing social hierarchy and perceived trustworthiness. Whether anyone truly believed in a sentient hearth is unclear, but the metaphor clearly shaped behaviour. You glance upward, following the smoke as it rises into the rafters. The ceiling is dark, layered with soot patterns that resemble maps of forgotten journeys. Each beam holds the residue of countless fires, each one adding another invisible layer of memory to the structure. A server passes behind you carrying a jug, moving with careful precision to avoid spilling its contents. The liquid inside sloshes faintly, catching firelight in brief flashes of gold. In many medieval port inns, ale and simple wine were not luxuries but staples of hydration, particularly in regions where water sources near harbours were often contaminated. This shaped drinking habits across all social classes, making communal drinking a daily necessity rather than an indulgence. You listen to fragments of conversation drifting around you. A delayed voyage, a cargo dispute, a rumour about weather shifting further north. Each sentence is incomplete, but together they form a loose map of the world beyond the walls. The storm outside presses again, and the inn responds with a low groan. It is subtle, almost unconscious, but you feel it. The structure is constantly adjusting, redistributing tension through its beams and joints. It is not just shelter, it is adaptation made visible. You notice how people react to that sound. No one panics, no one even comments. It is simply acknowledged through silence and slight posture adjustments. Life here includes the building's responses as part of normal awareness. A slightly unusual historical note preserved in merchant diaries from certain Atlantic and North Sea towns describes how harbour inns often doubled as informal weather observation points. Sailors and traders would share wind patterns, wave behaviour, and cloud formations, building collective predictions long before formal meteorology existed. These shared observations could determine whether ships left harbour or stayed anchored for days. You lean back, letting the warmth settle deeper into your muscles. The fatigue of travel begins to surface, not as sharp exhaustion, but as a slow softening of awareness. The edges of sound blur slightly. The crackle of fire becomes less distinct. Even conversation feels farther away, as though the room is expanding. A table nearby erupts briefly in excitement as a coin lands in a winning position during a game. The reaction is immediate but controlled. A short burst of energy that quickly returns to normal rhythm. Gambling here is not spectacle, it is background pulse. You notice a pair of travellers sharing food without formal agreement. One breaks bread, the other accepts it without hesitation. There is trust, but it is practical rather than emotional. In environments like this, generosity often functions as a form of temporary insurance rather than pure kindness. An interesting interpretive debate among researchers of medieval coastal economies centres on whether such inns fostered stronger communal bonds or simply reinforced transactional relationships under the illusion of familiarity. Some argue that shared hardship created genuine social cohesion. Others suggest it was merely efficient cooperation under pressure. You find yourself somewhere between those interpretations as you watch a man wipe steam from his beard and laugh quietly at something someone said beside him. It does not feel staged, it feels habitual. The fire shifts again, collapsing slightly as a log settles. Sparks rise in a brief constellation before disappearing into the darkness above. The room adjusts with it, shadow shifting across walls and faces. You realise that time inside this inn is not measured in minutes or hours. It is measured in changes of fire, arrivals of strangers, and shifts in weather outside. The storm is still present, but it has been translated into background awareness rather than immediate threat. A soft gust presses against the walls, and for a moment you imagine the sea itself leaning closer, listening, not hostile. Not friendly, just persistent. You close your eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to feel the balance of warmth and noise around you. The inn holds you in its layered system of heat, sound, and human presence. Everything is temporary here, but nothing feels unstable. When you open your eyes again, the fire is still burning steadily, and the room continues its quiet negotiation with the night. The warmth of the hearth begins to feel less like something you approached and more like something that has accepted you. Your clothing, still slightly damp from the harbour wind, gives off faint threads of steam that vanish almost immediately into the smoky air above. Around you, the inn continues its steady rhythm, But now your attention is slowly drawn away from the central fire and toward a darker edge of the room, where movement suggests a different direction entirely. A narrow staircase sits partially obscured between beams and shadow. It does not announce itself. Nothing in this inn announces anything loudly, it simply exists, as if expecting to be noticed only by those who are ready to leave the shared world below. You rise without urgency. The bench gives a soft complaint as weight leaves it, and the floor answers with a dull, familiar creak. No one looks at you for long. Movement is normal here. People come and go like tides within the same enclosed structure. As you approach the staircase, the noise of the main room begins to shift. The fire crackle remains, but conversation fades slightly behind it, as though sound itself becomes layered in thickness. The air also changes. Less heat, more wood, less smoke, more dust. It feels like stepping from a living organism into its skeleton. The stairs are narrow, worn in the centre where countless feet have shaped them over time. Each step carries a subtle unevenness. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to remind you that this building has not been standardized. It has been lived in. As you climb, your hand brushes the railing, smooth from years of contact in many medieval harbour inns. Staircases were often added or modified over generations rather than constructed all at once, especially in busy port towns where expansion happened whenever trade increased. One well-attested aspect of medieval urban architecture is this gradual accretion of structure, where buildings evolved more like organisms than engineered designs. Halfway up, you pause briefly. The sounds below are still present, but now muffled, like they belong to another layer of reality. The fire becomes a distant pulse instead of a central presence. You can still feel its warmth through the floorboards, but it is no longer dominant. A faint draught moves along the stairwell, carrying with it the scent of smoke and salt, even upstairs. The sea has not fully left you. It lingers in the building like memory embedded in wood. You continue upward. At the top of the stairs, the corridor is low and slightly uneven, with beams crossing overhead in a way that forces a gentle awareness of your posture. Nothing here allows you to forget the shape of the building. You pass closed doors, each one marked only by faint differences in wood grain, iron hinges, or the way light seeps through gaps. Behind some of those doors, you imagine travellers resting, sailors recovering from long voyages, merchants counting losses or gains in silence, pilgrims stretching sore legs after weeks on roads that never seem to end. Medieval harbour inns often housed a wide variety of guests in shared or partitioned spaces, especially during winter storms when travel was impossible. Rooms were rarely private in the modern sense. Boundaries were porous, often defined more by habit than by walls. You stop briefly outside one door as a muffled sound filters through it. A cough, a shifting bed frame, life continuing behind thin barriers. An odd detail preserved in certain coastal oral traditions speaks of inns where guests believed the walls learned voices over time, absorbing conversations and returning them as echoes during storms. Whether this was genuine belief or poetic exaggeration is unclear, but it reflects how deeply people associated buildings with memory. You move on. At the end of the corridor, a small lantern hangs from a hook, swaying slightly with each draught. Its light is weaker than the fire below, but steadier. It does not flicker with conversation or laughter, it simply persists. You notice how the architecture becomes more intimate the higher you go. The beams lower slightly, the spaces narrow, and the sound becomes more contained. It feels less like a public space and more like a temporary holding of private lives within a shared structure. One well-documented aspect of medieval port towns is how inns adapted upper floors for sleeping quarters that maximize occupancy rather than comfort. Beds were often shared or placed closely together, and privacy was minimal. Yet travellers accepted this as part of the economy of movement. Space was a tradable resource. just like goods or coin. You reach a door that stands slightly ajar. Warm air spills from within, softer than the heat below, more contained. You push it gently open. Inside, the room is simple. A slanted ceiling follows the roofline, and wooden beams cut across it like exposed ribs. The beds are arranged closely, separated only by narrow gaps or hanging cloths that offer the illusion of division rather than true separation. A small window sits at one end, its glass uneven and slightly clouded, showing only the faint suggestion of storm cloud still moving beyond the harbour. You step inside. The sound changes again. Now it is mostly wind pressing against the structure, the distant rhythm of waves, and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to temperature and pressure. It is quieter, but not silent. Silence does not exist in buildings like this. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of a bed frame. The wood is worn smooth, polished by years of use. In some medieval harbour inns, bedding was provided in layers of straw and wool blankets, both practical and easily replaced. Cleanliness was relative, shaped more by necessity than expectation. A quirky detail from maritime folklore suggests that in certain regions, travellers believe sleeping near the window allowed them to hear the sea's direction in dreams. A poetic idea linking rest with navigation, while likely symbolic. It reveals how deeply maritime life shaped even sleep-related beliefs. You move further into the room, taking in the arrangement of space, and there is no single dominant point here like the hearth below. Instead, everything is distributed. Beds, light, shadows. Each element exists in equal measure. You can imagine how this space transforms during full occupancy. The soft sounds of breathing, the shifting of blankets, the occasional whisper that fades quickly into sleep. Medieval inns in busy ports often operated near capacity during storm seasons, and sleeping arrangements became communal by necessity. Some accounts suggest travellers even synchronised their rest patterns with the rhythm of the inn, sleeping when others did simply because it was easier. You glance towards the window again. The storm outside is still present, but less violent here. It feels distant, as though filtered through layers of wood and memory. A subtle thought emerges as you stand in the centre of the room. Historians still debate whether such shared sleeping environments fostered stronger social bonds among travellers, or whether they simply reflected economic constraints that left individuals with no choice but to adapt. Either way, the result is the same. People rested here together, separated by little more than intention and thin cloth. You step back toward the doorway, leaving the room undisturbed. There is a sense that this space is waiting rather than offering. It is not yet yours, but it could be. As you descend your gaze slightly, you notice how the corridor light has shifted. The fire below has changed intensity, sending a faint glow upward through the structure. The entire inn feels connected through temperature and sound, as if every level is part of one continuous system. You begin your slow descent back toward the main hall, carrying with you the awareness that this building is not divided into rooms so much as layers of shared existence. And somewhere beneath your feet, the hearth continues to burn, anchoring everything above it. You descend the narrow staircase again, each step bringing you closer to the layered noise and warmth of the common hall below. The sound returns before the sight does. First the fire, then the voices, then the subtle rhythm of movement that defines everything inside this harbour inn. It feels like slipping back into a shared heartbeat after a brief period of isolation. At the bottom, the air changes again. It is thicker here, more humid with breath, smoke, and the faint scent of spilled ale that has already soaked into the wood over years of use. The hearth remains the centre of gravity, but now your attention shifts slightly away from it, toward the variety of people occupying its orbit. This is where you begin to notice them more clearly as individuals rather than background presence. The room is no longer just a single system of warmth and survival. It is a collection of overlapping journeys. At a long bench near the fire, a merchant adjusts the edge of a heavy wool cloak. His fingers move with the practiced care of someone who has handled coins in multiple currencies, possibly from different trading regions along medieval European coastal routes. One well-established aspect of maritime commerce in this era is how ports served as convergence points for diverse economic systems, requiring merchants to constantly adapt to varying weights, measures, and coinage standards. You can almost see that adaptability reflected in the way he touches his pouch, as if constantly accounting for invisible conversions. Nearby, a sailor leans back with the posture of someone whose body still remembers the rhythm of a ship even while on land. His legs are slightly apart for balance that is no longer needed. A faint scar runs along his knuckle, but it is not emphasized, just part of him. He speaks quietly to another man, gesturing with small, controlled movements. Their conversation is not loud enough for you to fully hear, but it rises and falls like a tide of half-formed certainty. You settle again near the fire, though not too close this time. The heat is intense enough to make the air shimmer faintly above the flames. Shadows stretch and retract along the beams overhead, creating a sense of slow motion even when nothing is actually moving. A group of travellers sits slightly apart from the main cluster. They are bundled together in a way that suggests shared journey rather than shared origin. One of them unwraps a small piece of preserved food, offering it without ceremony. Another accepts without hesitation. In this world, food sharing often signals practical trust rather than emotional intimacy. A well-observed pattern in medieval port environments is how necessity often overrides formal social boundaries, especially among people far from their home communities. You listen to fragments of conversation drifting across the room, a mention of a delayed ship, a complaint about tariffs, a rumour about weather patterns shifting further along the coast. Each piece is incomplete, yet together they form a loose network of information that spreads without structure or authority. An odd detail preserved in coastal oral traditions describes harbour inns as places where strangers briefly become neighbours without becoming friends. It is a poetic way of describing something practical. People coexisted closely, but only temporarily, bound by circumstance rather than permanence. You notice a subtle interaction near the fire. A man places a coin on the table, and another responds with a nod rather than words. No dramatic gesture follows. The exchange is quiet, almost invisible unless you are paying attention. This kind of understated communication was common in busy trading inns, where too much attention could disrupt delicate agreements. Some surviving accounts from Port Town suggest that many transactions were completed with minimal speech to avoid interference or misunderstanding. The fire crackles louder for a moment as a log shifts, sending a small burst of sparks upward. The room reacts subtly. A few heads tilt. Someone adjusts their seating. The environment is constantly registering change. Even when humans appear relaxed, you become more aware of how sound travels here. Not evenly, but in layers. Close conversations are soft but distinct. Distant ones blur into indistinct hum. The fire sits between them, anchoring everything with its own rhythm. A well-documented aspect of medieval harbour inns is their role as multilingual spaces in many coastal trading hubs, especially those connected to broader European trade networks. It was common to hear multiple languages or dialects in the same room. Communication often relied on mixed vocabulary, gestures, and shared trade terms rather than formal linguistic consistency. You can sense that possibility here in the way certain words are emphasized differently, as if shaped by varied origins. A man near the edge of the fire laughs briefly, then stops as if remembering something serious. The transition is quick, almost invisible. Emotional states here shift easily, shaped by fatigue, warmth, and the uncertainty of travel. You rest your hands on the bench beside you, feeling the worn texture of wood that has been smoothed by years of use. It carries faint grooves where countless people have leaned, rested, or collapsed into exhaustion. The material remembers contact more than it preserves identity. A quirky detail found in some maritime folklore traditions suggests that harbour inns were sometimes believed to collect voices over time, storing echoes of conversations that could be heard faintly during storms when wind passed through their beams. While likely symbolic, it reflects how deeply people associated these buildings with memory and repetition. You notice a shift in the room as a new arrival enters. The door opens briefly, letting in a slice of cold air that immediately disappears into the warmth. The newcomer pauses just inside, adjusting to the difference in temperature. No one reacts strongly, but the room subtly recalibrates around them. Attention spreads and then settles again. The innkeeper is visible again near the counter, though partially obscured by movement. Their presence continues to function like a stabilizing point rather than a dominant figure. Orders are taken, decisions are acknowledged, but the room operates largely on its own rhythm. You find yourself observing how fluid the social structure is here. There is no fixed hierarchy in the visible sense, yet there is still order. People respond to experience, familiarity, and necessity rather than formal rank. A sailor with more knowledge of storms may temporarily command attention. A merchant with more coin may influence access to resources. Authority shifts depending on context. An interpretive debate among researchers of medieval coastal economies concerns whether such inns encouraged social fluidity or merely reflected the already flexible hierarchies of port life. Some suggest inns were spaces where class distinctions softened temporarily under shared conditions. Others argue that underlying inequalities remained fully intact, simply expressed in quieter ways. You watch a brief exchange at a nearby table where a man offers information in return for a drink. The transaction is simple but revealing. Knowledge itself has value here, even if only for a moment. Outside, the storm still exists, but it feels further away now, as if the inn has absorbed part of its intensity. The building creaks softly in response to another gust, not as alarm but as acknowledgement. You begin to understand that this place does not resist the storm, it accommodates it. You exhale slowly, feeling the rhythm of the room settle into you again. Firelight, conversation, movement, stillness. All of it layered, all of it temporary and somewhere above. The sleeping rooms wait in quiet readiness for bodies that will eventually seek them. You remain near the fire, but your attention begins to drift outward again, not toward the flames themselves, but toward what the room is made of beyond them. The inn feels different now that you have moved through its layers once already. It is no longer unfamiliar. Instead, it reveals itself slowly, like a map you are learning to read by touch rather than sight. The warmth around you is steady, but something subtler is shifting in the air. You sense more clearly now that your body is adjusted to the heat. Smoke is still present, but underneath it there are other traces. Dry grain, salted fish, wax, and something sharper, almost foreign, that does not belong to any single place you can name immediately. That scent leads your thoughts outward, beyond the walls of the inn and into the networks that feed it. One well-documented feature of medieval harbour towns is their dependence on long-distance trade routes that carried not only goods but entire atmospheres of exchange. Spices from Asia, preserved fish from northern waters, wax from forest regions, and textiles from distant workshops all converged in coastal ports. Inns like this one existed because those routes existed. They were not separate from trade, they were part of its living infrastructure. You glance toward a nearby table where a small pouch has been opened. A faint aroma spills out, warm and slightly sweet, cutting through the heavier smells of the room. Someone has brought spices, likely cinnamon or cloves, though not in abundance. These are not everyday substances for most people here. They are treated with a kind of quiet respect, used sparingly, almost ceremonially. A merchant nearby leans forward slightly as if recognizing the scent, and you notice how attention subtly shifts in that direction. Goods do not need to be displayed loudly here. Even a trace of something rare is enough to change the tone of a conversation. Your fingers rest loosely on the edge of the bench, and you begin to notice how the wood beneath you carries faint variations in texture. Some sections are smoother, others more worn. This is not uniform craftsmanship, it is accumulated use. Each mark represents repeated contact. Countless nights of rest, course, negotiation, waiting, and departure. The fire pops suddenly, sending a brief flicker of light across the room. Shadows stretch and contract along the beams overhead. In that moment, the inn feels almost like a breathing organism again, responding not just to weather outside but to movement within. A nearby group begins speaking in lower tones, and you catch fragments of their exchange. Words about cargo, routes, and timing. It is not a formal discussion, but it carries the structure of planning. In many medieval port environments, especially those tied into European maritime trade systems, informal coordination often took place in inns rather than official halls. Contracts could be discussed over food and drink long before they were written down elsewhere. This blending of social space and economic planning was one of the defining features of harbour life. You lean slightly to adjust your position, and the bench responds with a soft creak. That sound seems to ripple outward, absorbed into the general texture of the room. Nothing here exists in isolation. Every small action becomes part of the wider atmosphere. A sailor at a nearby table removes a glove and flexes his hand slowly, as if still remembering the shape of ropes and rigging. His movements are minimal but precise. You notice faint salt staining along the seams of his clothing, evidence of prolonged exposure to sea spray. People here carry the sea with them, even when they are not on it. A lesser-known detail preserved in maritime folklore describes how sailors would sometimes identify inns not by name but by scent or sound. The crackle of a specific kind of wood, the mixture of spices in the air, or even the rhythm of the inn's busiest hours could become identifiers more reliable than written signs in certain ports where literacy varied. Whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal remains uncertain, but it reflects how sensory memory shaped navigation through urban space. You shift your gaze toward the counter again. The innkeeper is partially visible, moving between tasks with quiet efficiency. A ledger is opened, then closed. A container is lifted, then set down. Every motion is purposeful but not hurried. There is no wasted energy in their movements, only continuity. Around you, conversation rises briefly as someone tells a story about a voyage delayed by the weather further north. The details are inconsistent, but the emotional shape of the story is clear. Frustration, endurance, and eventual adaptation. Stories like this circulate constantly in places like this, where lived experience often becomes shared narrative within hours. You begin to notice how the inn filters information. It does not verify it. It absorbs it. It reshapes it through repetition, tone, and reaction. What emerges is not strict accuracy but communal understanding. A small bowl is placed on a nearby table, and steam rises from it in slow curls. The smell suggests a thick stew, likely made from preserved meat, legumes, and whatever vegetables could be stored through winter. Food in harbour inns during colder months often relied on long preservation methods, including salting, drying, and fermentation. This allowed coastal communities to maintain sustenance during storms that prevented fresh supply arrivals. You feel a faint heaviness in your body now, not from fatigue alone, but from immersion in the environment. The combination of heat, sound, and smell begins to soften your sense of time. Minutes lose their sharp edges. A quiet exchange catches your attention. Two men lean toward each other, speaking in short phrases, then pausing as if measuring each word. One produces a small object, possibly a token or tally marker. The other nods. No further ceremony follows. In many trading ports, especially those influenced by merchant guild practices, physical tokens were often used as proof of agreement or payment. This reduced the need for lengthy verbal confirmation in multilingual environments. You find yourself watching these interactions with growing subtlety. Nothing is performed for attention. Everything is functional, yet layered with meaning. A sudden burst of laughter rises from a different corner of the room, breaking the steady rhythm for a moment before dissolving back into background noise. The contrast between intensity and calm feels natural here, not disruptive. Outside, though you cannot see it clearly, the storm still presses against the building. You can sense it through the way the walls respond occasionally. A faint shifting sound like wood adjusting its posture. Yet inside, that pressure has become part of the atmosphere rather than an intrusion. Some academic interpretations of coastal urban life suggest that inns like this functioned as transitional zones between land-based order and sea-based unpredictability. Others emphasize their role as purely economic spaces, shaped by necessity rather than cultural symbolism. Both perspectives seem present in the room around you, depending on where you choose to focus. You lean back slightly, letting your shoulders settle into the warmth again. The fire continues its slow transformation of fuel into light and heat. Above it, smoke disappears into darkness that you no longer think about as empty, but as layered space filled with invisible history. The inn continues its quiet work of holding people together without requiring them to belong to one another. And for now, that is enough. The fire continues its slow breathing rhythm, but something in the room begins to change. It is not sudden, not dramatic, but perceptible in the way sound behaves. Conversations that were once layered and steady now carry a slightly sharper edge. Chairs shift more often. People glance toward the walls and then away again, as if acknowledging something they would rather not name aloud. You notice it first in the wind. It presses harder against the inn than it has all evening. Not a single force, but a series of pushes, like the sea itself is testing the building in repeated intervals. The wooden beams respond with faint creaks that travel through the structure like quiet warnings. You feel them more than you hear them. A well-attested feature of coastal settlements in northern Europe during the medieval period is their exposure to rapidly changing maritime weather systems, especially during winter months when low-pressure storms moved in from the Atlantic with little warning. These storms could trap entire ports for days, sometimes weeks, cutting off travel and delaying trade. Inns near harbours became essential shelters during these interruptions, absorbing not only travellers but the tension of weather-bound economies. You shift slightly on the bench, feeling the subtle vibration of the floor beneath you. It is not instability, it is communication. The building is responding to pressure in a way that feels almost intentional. A nearby group falls quieter, their conversation tapering into shorter phrases. One of them glances toward the door, then returns to their drink. No one comments on the storm directly, yet everyone is aware of it in a shared, unspoken way. A lesser-known detail preserved in the maritime accounts this describes how experienced sailors could read storms is not only from the sky, but from the behaviour of buildings along the coast. Inns, warehouses, and dock structures were believed to give subtle warnings through sound and movement before the worst of the weather arrived. Whether this was practical observation or retrospective storytelling is difficult to determine, but it reflects the deep connection between architecture and environment in coastal life. The fire flares briefly as a log collapses inward. Sparks rise quickly, then vanish into the smoky darkness above. The sudden brightness draws attention for a moment, and you notice how several people instinctively turn toward it, as if reassured by its continued stability. You begin to see how the inn manages balance. It does not resist the storm outside, it absorbs its influence and redistributes it through warmth, sound, and human presence. The interior becomes a kind of buffer zone where external chaos is translated into manageable sensation. Another gust strikes the building, stronger than before. The walls answer with a deeper groan, and for a brief moment, conversation nearly pauses, not out of fear, but out of instinctive recalibration. People listen to the structure itself. A small but important historical note from coastal trade regions suggests that harbour inns often doubled as informal weather-gathering points, where sailors, fishermen, and merchants would exchange observations about wind direction, cloud formation, and wave behaviour. These shared assessments sometimes influenced whether ships departed or remained docked. In that sense, the inn functioned as an early collective forecasting environment, shaped by experience rather than formal science. You look around again, noticing how many faces are now oriented slightly differently than before, not toward each other, but toward the building itself. Listening has become more physical. A faint drip of water somewhere near a window catches your attention. It is small, intermittent, but rhythmic. You cannot tell if it is rain intensifying or condensation forming within the structure. Either way, it adds another layer to the soundscape. A quirky detail preserved in coastal folklore tells of inns that were said to tighten during storms, as if the building itself drew inward like a living creature bracing against cold, while clearly metaphorical. This idea likely emerged from repeated observations of wooden structures contracting and creaking in response to temperature drops and wind pressure. You notice a shift in the crowd. Some travellers move closer to the fire. Others adjust their seating slightly away from drafts. No one gives instructions. The behaviour is instinctive, learned through experience rather than spoken guidance. The innkeeper appears briefly at the edge of your awareness, moving between tables with quiet assessment. Their attention seems sharper now, not anxious, but more focused, as if tracking the condition of both people and building simultaneously. A ledger remains under one arm, but their gaze moves more frequently toward the walls and ceiling. You realise that hospitality here includes environmental awareness. The innkeeper is not only managing guests, but also interpreting the building's responses. Another gust presses against the structure, and this time the sound is longer, deeper. The entire inn seems to shift slightly in response, not dangerously, but noticeably. Conversations do not stop. They become more compact, more efficient. Words are chosen carefully, as if excess speech is unnecessary under current conditions. A sailor near you mutters something about timing, though you cannot catch the full meaning. Another person nods without responding. The exchange is brief but charged with shared understanding. Some academic interpretations of medieval coastal life suggest that storms played a central role in shaping not only economic cycles but also social behaviour within port communities. Extended periods of confinement often intensified interactions within inns, leading to both collaboration and tension depending on the circumstances. Others argue that these effects were overstated and that daily routines continued with minimal disruption except in extreme cases. You watch as someone adds another log to the fire. The motion is deliberate, almost ritualistic. The flames respond immediately, growing taller for a moment before settling back into steadier movement. The warmth intensifies slightly, counterbalancing the cooling air that seeps through unseen gaps. Outside, the storm is no longer just present. It feels active in its intention, not hostile, but persistent, like an ongoing question pressed against the walls. You find yourself more aware of your own posture, shoulders slightly angled inward, hands closer to your body. These are not conscious decisions, but responses shaped by environment. A lesser-known detail from maritime records describes how some inns developed informal storm routines, where guests and staff would subtly reorganize interior space during severe weather. This might include moving sleeping areas away from draft points, reinforcing doors with additional beams, or clustering activity closer to central heat sources. These adaptations were rarely formalized, yet they became part of collective habit. You begin to understand that the inn is not static, it is reactive. Every person inside contributes, even without realizing it, to how the structure responds to external pressure. A faint moment of stillness arrives between gusts. In that brief pause, the room feels almost suspended. Conversations resume, but gently, cautiously, as if not to disturb the temporary calm. You exhale slowly, feeling the warmth of the fire settle back into your clothing. The storm has not ended, it has simply adjusted its rhythm, and the inn, in turn, continues its quiet negotiation with the sea. The storm outside continues its steady pressure against the inn, but inside, something else begins to take shape. The warmth from the hearth deepens, spreading further into corners that had previously held only shadow. The air thickens with the scent of cooked grain, salt, and slow-simmered stew. You realize, almost without noticing the transition, that food is now becoming the center of attention rather than fire alone. Movement increases around the room, but in a controlled and familiar way. Wooden bowls are passed from hand to hand. Thick spoons scrape softly against their interiors. The rhythm of eating begins to overlay the rhythm of conversation, and the inn shifts into a different mode of existence. One well-established feature of medieval harbour inns was their reliance on simple, communal meals that could be prepared in large quantities and served quickly to travellers whose arrivals were unpredictable. These meals were not designed for refinement but for endurance. Stews made from preserved meats, dried legumes, and root vegetables formed the backbone of winter sustenance in many coastal settlements, especially when storms disrupted supply chains from inland farms. You receive a bowl at some point without ceremony. It is placed near you, not handed with flourish, simply positioned as part of the ongoing flow of service. The warmth of it rises immediately into your face. The smell is dense, earthy, and slightly smoky, as if the ingredients have been slowly transforming over hours rather than minutes. You take a moment before eating, observing others. A man nearby eats quickly, almost mechanically, as though his body has decided that warmth must be absorbed as efficiently as possible. Another traveller eats more slowly, pausing between bites to listen to fragments of conversation around him. There is no single rhythm of consumption here. Each person adapts to their own internal sense of urgency. A lesser-known detail preserved in regional coastal records suggests that harbour inns often served as informal redistribution points for surplus food during storm seasons. Merchants delayed by weather would sometimes offload perishable goods to inns, where they were incorporated into communal meals. This practice helped reduce waste while also ensuring that stranded travellers were fed. Though the exact organisation of such exchanges likely varied widely from port to port, you lift the spoon and taste the stew. It is simple but grounding. The saltiness reminds you faintly of the sea outside, but the warmth pulls you inward, away from it. Each mouthful feels like it is rebuilding something in your body that the wind had slowly worn down. Around you, conversation continues in soft, uneven layers. A group near the fire discusses the timing of a delayed ship. Another table speaks about prices in a distant market town. Someone laughs briefly, then returns to eating as if laughter and sustenance are part of the same cycle. You notice how eating changes the tone of the room. Voices become less performative, gestures slow, attention turns inward, and even the innkeeper, visible near the counter, moves with slightly less urgency, as if acknowledging that this moment is not about transactions but maintenance. A subtle historical interpretation often associated with maritime trade communities emphasizes how shared meals in inns functioned as temporary equalizers. Within these spaces, Distinctions of class or occupation soften temporarily, not because they disappeared entirely, but because the practical necessity of eating together created overlapping rhythms of behaviour. Some researchers argue this effect was limited and situational, while others suggest it played a significant role in shaping coastal social cohesion. You take another spoonful, noticing how heat builds gradually in your chest. The food is not elaborate, but it carries weight. It fills space that was previously occupied by cold air and fatigue. A small group nearby leans closer together as they speak in lower tones. Their discussion seems more focused now, less about storytelling and more about decisions. One of them produces a small object, possibly a token or mark of agreement, and places it briefly on the table before retrieving it again. The exchange is subtle but deliberate. You begin to understand how food, conversation, and negotiation are layered together here without clear separation. Nothing is isolated, everything overlaps. A quirky detail preserved in maritime folklore from certain coastal regions suggests that harbour inns were sometimes believed to season their food with the presence of storms themselves, as if weather influenced flavour. While clearly symbolic, this idea reflects how deeply environmental conditions were integrated into sensory interpretation of daily life. The fire crackles again, and light flickers across the room in slow waves. Shadows shift over faces and table edges, briefly distorting expressions before returning them to clarity. You find yourself watching this pattern more than the people themselves for a moment, as if the light is telling its own version of the room's story. Outside, the storm remains active, but it feels more distant now, as though the inn has absorbed enough of its presence to soften its impact. The building continues its quiet creaking, but it no longer feels like warning. It feels like background communication. You notice a slight change in temperature as someone opens a door briefly, letting in a narrow breath of colder air. The contrast is immediate and sharp, but it vanishes quickly as the door closes again. Inside, warmth reasserts itself without effort. Some historical accounts of coastal inns describe how mealtimes during storms often extended longer than usual, not due to abundance but due to shared necessity. People lingered over food not only to eat but to remain within the warmth and stability of the communal space. Others interpret this behaviour differently, suggesting it was simply a practical response to limited mobility during severe weather. You finish another portion of the stew, feeling the edges of hunger soften into comfort. The sensation is not indulgent, it is stabilizing. A man across from you leans back slightly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He exhales slowly, then returns his attention to the room rather than his bowl. The transition from eating to observing is seamless, as if both states are part of the same cycle. You become aware again of the innkeeper's presence. They are watching the room in a broader sense, ensuring that the movement, food, and conversation remain balanced. Their role is less about control and more about continuity. They ensure that nothing breaks the rhythm. A lesser-known observation from medieval port documentation suggests that innkeepers often adjusted meal preparation based on storm duration, anticipating how long travellers might be confined indoors. This required a kind of intuitive forecasting that combined experience, observation, and informal communication with sailors and dock workers. You place your bowl down for a moment, letting the warmth of the room settle fully into you. The combination of food, fire, and sound creates a layered sense of stability that feels almost separate from the world outside. For a brief moment, you realize how complete this system is. The inn is not simply shelter from the storm. It's a self-contained environment that adapts continuously to external pressure while maintaining internal balance, and within that balance, you remain quietly held. The bowl in your hands is now half empty, but the room feels fuller than before. Not louder, not more crowded, just denser. As if the space itself has absorbed the act of eating and turned it into something heavier, something shared. The fire continues to burn at the centre, yet your attention keeps drifting toward the edges of the room, where light weakens and shadows gather in thicker folds. That is where the real movement begins. Not the obvious kind, not footsteps or raised voices, something subtler. A leaning closer than necessary, a pause that lasts a little too long before a reply, a hand resting near a pouch without opening it. The kind of behaviour that only becomes visible once you stop watching the centre of things. You notice a corner table where two figures sit partially turned away from the main room. Their conversation is quiet enough that it dissolves before reaching you, but their posture tells its own story. One leans forward slightly, elbows near the table edge, the other keeps their hands closer to their body, as if measuring distance even in stillness. Surviving accounts from medieval port towns suggest that inns like this often became informal meeting points for trade arrangements that were too small or too sensitive for official guild halls. Goods changed hands here in ways that rarely made it into formal records, not because they were illegal in most cases, but because they existed in a grey area between convenience and necessity. You take another slow bite of stew, watching without staring. The heat of the food grounds you, but your awareness expands outward, around the edges of the firelight. The room feels like it is constantly negotiating itself. A man near the wall shifts position, revealing a small exchange happening beneath the table. Something passes from one hand to another. It is quick, practiced, almost invisible unless you are already looking for it. No one reacts, no one interrupts. The moment is absorbed into the flow of everything else. A curious belief recorded in maritime lore describes harbour inns as places where words could change value depending on the hour. In practical terms, this likely reflects how rapidly information about weather, prices, or shipping conditions could alter decisions. A rumour in the morning might be irrelevant by evening, replaced by new arrivals from the docks in such an environment. Trust was not fixed, it was constantly recalculated. You shift slightly on the bench, feeling the wood respond with a low creak. The sound is small, but in this room even small sounds seem to travel farther than expected. A few nearby conversations pause for a fraction of a moment, then resume as if that pause never happened. In the far corner, a small group laughs softly, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to signal ease. They are likely travellers sharing temporary alignment rather than long-term connection. In places like this, alliances are often as short-lived as storms. One widely observed feature of medieval coastal economies was the way inns functioned as pressure valves for information. Ships delayed by weather created clusters of waiting people, and those clusters naturally generated exchanges of news, speculation, and negotiation. The inn becomes not just a shelter but a kind of sorting space for uncertainty. You glance again toward the counter. The innkeeper is partially visible, moving between tasks with the same steady rhythm you have noticed before. There is no visible reaction to the quieter exchanges happening in the corners. That in itself feels intentional. Nothing here is treated as separate from normal operation. A server passes behind you carrying a tray with empty bowls stacked unevenly. The movement is careful but unremarkable. No one watches them, yet everyone unconsciously makes space. This kind of coordination without instruction is everywhere in the room. You realize that secrecy here is not about hiding in darkness. It is about blending into motion. Deals are not concealed so much as absorbed into the normal texture of interaction. A faint scent shifts through the air again. Not spice this time, but something sharper. Perhaps iron from a tool or coin, or simply the smell of wet wool drying too close to heat. The layering of smells creates a kind of invisible map of activity. Even without seeing anything directly, you begin to understand where attention should be. Another table slightly closer to the fire leans inward as someone speaks in a lower tone. The group reacts with small gestures, a nod, a brief silence, then the conversation continues. redirected but not interrupted. Some interpretations of medieval port society suggest that inns served as semi-public negotiation zones where economic agreements were tested socially before being formalized elsewhere. Others argue that this interpretation exaggerates the intentionality of such spaces, suggesting instead that most interactions were opportunistic rather than structured. Either way, what is clear from surviving documentation is that these environments facilitated a constant flow of informal exchange. You finish another spoonful of stew, noticing that the warmth now feels less like heat and more like stability. Your body is adjusted without you noticing. A man near the centre of the room slides a small object across the table. It catches the firelight briefly before disappearing into another hand. No words accompany it. The exchange feels final, yet unremarked upon. You wonder how many such moments occur in a single evening, without ever being acknowledged beyond those directly involved. A quirky tradition preserved in coastal storytelling describes certain inns as places where coin and conversation travelled on the same tide. It is a poetic way of describing something practical. Money, information, and trust move together in overlapping currents, never entirely separate. You become aware again of how little true separation exists in this room, eating, talking, negotiating, waiting, observing, all of it overlaps without clear boundaries. The storm outside presses faintly against the walls again, but it feels distant now, almost irrelevant compared to the layered activity within. The building holds it at the edges, translating its force into background sound rather than intrusion. A nearby conversation shifts tone slightly, becoming more relaxed. Whatever tension existed a moment ago seems to have settled. You notice how quickly emotional temperature can change in this environment, often influenced by something as simple as food, warmth, or successful exchange. The fire pops softly, and a few sparks rise before fading into darkness above. The ceiling absorbs them without reaction, as it has absorbed everything else. You lean back slightly, letting the final traces of stew settle into warmth inside you, around you. The room continues its quiet choreography of presence and exchange. Nothing is fully hidden here, yet nothing is fully exposed either. It is a space built on partial visibility, where understanding depends not on clarity but on attention, and as the night deepens, even that attention begins to soften. The last traces of your meal settle into warmth, and for a moment you simply remain still, letting the rhythm of the room continue around you without interruption. The fire crackles with a steady confidence now, as if it has fully established control over its small territory within the inn. Conversation ebbs and flows, but your attention begins to drift outward again. Beyond the immediate circle of heat and voices, something about the building keeps pulling your awareness toward its outer edges. You notice the walls more clearly now, not as background, but as active participants in the experience. Thick timber, darkened by years of smoke and salt air, holds the space together with quiet determination. Every creak, every shift, every subtle vibration seems to travel through them before reaching your ears. A well-established feature of medieval harbour architecture in northern trading towns was the use of heavy wooden framing combined with the stone foundations to withstand constant exposure to coastal storms. These structures were not static in behaviour. They flex slightly under pressure, allowing wind force to be absorbed rather than resisted outright. That flexibility is something you can almost feel now in the way the inn responds to each gust. Outside, the storm is still active, though no longer overwhelming. It has settled into a consistent rhythm, a kind of repetitive pressure that comes and goes in waves. Each impact against the walls sends a soft echo through the interior, like the building is translating weather into sound rather than blocking it entirely. You shift your position slightly, yes, and the bench responds with a familiar groan. Nearby, someone does the same, and another chair answers in kind. it becomes clear that the room is not silent even when people are quiet. The structure itself contributes a constant layer of noise, a hidden language of wood under strain and release. A group near the fire begins to gather their belongings, not in haste, but with the calm efficiency of people who understand that movement is always temporary here. One of them ties a small pouch and places it carefully inside a larger bag. Another checks the condition of a cloak, brushing off crumbs or dust with slow, deliberate movements. One widely observed feature of medieval harbour inns was how closely human activity was tied to environmental conditions. When storms intensified, people often adjusted their routines indoors, shifting from active trade discussions to maintenance, storytelling, or rest. The inn functioned as a flexible social container, adapting its internal rhythm to match external pressure. You watch as a man near the wall leans back and closes his eyes briefly, not sleeping, just resting. His posture suggests familiarity with long waiting periods, the kind that come from travel delays that stretch unpredictably in coastal towns. This kind of waiting was not unusual. Weather dictated time more than schedules ever could. A faint draft moves through the room again, and you notice how several people subtly adjust their seating without acknowledging it. One person turns slightly away from the door, another draws closer to the fire. These small adjustments form a collective response that no one has explicitly coordinated. A lesser-known detail preserved in maritime accounts describes how sailors often developed an intuitive awareness of building responses during storms. They could interpret subtle changes in creaking patterns, airflow, and temperature as indicators of storm strength. Whether this was accurate observation or retrospective storytelling is difficult to determine, but it highlights the deep connection between human perception and architectural behaviour in coastal environments. You glance toward the door again. It remains closed, but it feels more present now, as if its existence is emphasized by the pressure outside. The threshold between inside and outside is not just physical, it is psychological. Inside, the room continues its layered existence. A low conversation near the fire turns briefly into laughter, then settles again. Another group leans inward to discuss something that seems logistical rather than social. The distinction between personal and practical life remains fluid. A curious belief recorded in maritime storytelling traditions suggests that harbour inns could measure storms by the patience of their guests. The idea is symbolic rather than literal, implying that the longer people remained calm and settled indoors, the more stable the environment felt. In reality, this likely reflects how human behaviour adapts collectively to prolonged weather conditions. You notice that your own sense of time is beginning to blur. The sequence of eating, observing, and listening no longer feels segmented. It flows continuously, without clear division. Across the room, a sailor stands and stretches, rolling his shoulders slowly as if uncoiling tension accumulated over hours or days. His movement is unremarkable, yet it draws a brief glance from others before being absorbed back into the general rhythm. The fire shifts again, a log collapsing inward and sending a brief surge of heat outward. The room responds with a subtle recalibration. People lean back slightly, then settle again. No one comments, everyone simply adjusts. Some interpretations of medieval coastal social environments suggest that inns acted as stabilizing spaces during periods of environmental disruption. When external conditions limited movement, internal structures of interaction became more pronounced. Others argue that this perspective overemphasizes cohesion, pointing out that inns were also sites of tension, uncertainty, and competing interests. Both interpretations feel visible here. Depending on where you choose to look, you become aware of how the inn organizes attention. The fire draws the center, the edges hold negotiation, the walls manage pressure, the counter regulates exchange. Each part plays a role without needing instruction. A server passes again, this time moving more slowly, carrying fewer items. The reduction in pace is subtle but noticeable. It suggests a transition in the room's activity, from consumption toward maintenance and eventual rest. You notice that fewer new conversations are starting now. Existing ones continue, but with less intensity. Energy is dispersing rather than accumulating. Outside, the storm continues its presence, but its impact feels more distributed. Instead of sharp force, it becomes steady background pressure. The building absorbs it evenly. A quirky detail preserved in coastal oral traditions describes certain inns as places where storms were believed to lose their sharpness, as if the act of entering human space softened their intensity, while clearly metaphorical. This idea reflects how shelter transforms perception of external forces. You exhale slowly, noticing how your breathing has matched the rhythm of the room. Not intentionally, but naturally. The environment has adjusted you as much as you have observed it. A man nearby folds his arms and leans forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze is unfocused, directed more inward than outward, around him. Others display similar signs of gradual winding down. The room is not yet preparing for sleep, but it is shifting away from active engagement. The innkeeper appears again near the counter, scanning the room with steady attention. Their movements are minimal, but their awareness seems wide. They are not only watching people, but also the flow of the evening itself, as if measuring when one phase ends and another begins. You realize that this transition is not announced. It happens through accumulation of small changes, lower volume, slower movement, longer pauses between words. The storm outside continues, but inside, the inn has entered a different state entirely, and you find yourself quietly held within it. The room has settled into a sour rhythm now, the kind that does not announce itself but simply replaces what came before. Voices are still present, yet they no longer rise and fall with urgency. Instead, they stretch out, softened by fatigue and warmth, as if every sentence has to pass through the fire before reaching the ear. You remain seated near the hearth, but your attention is no longer anchored to any single place. It drifts gently from face to face, from movement to movement, as though the inn itself is beginning to tell a different kind of story, one that does not rely on events, but on repetition. A man near the fire stirs what is left of his drink, watching the surface as if it contained something more than liquid. Another traveller leans back against a beam, eyes half-lidded, not fully asleep but no longer fully engaged. A woman adjusts her shawl with slow precision, then pauses with her hand still resting on the fabric, as if deciding whether further movement is necessary. One widely observed feature of medieval harbour inns during extended storms was this gradual shift from activity to endurance. When travel was impossible and ships remained anchored, people did not simply become idle, they adapted into a state of waiting that blended rest, conversation, and quiet maintenance of daily needs. This was not leisure in the modern sense, but a structured pause shaped by environmental constraint. You notice how the fire seems to burn differently now, not stronger or weaker, but steadier. The flames move with less volatility, as if they too have adjusted to the reduced energy in the room. Sparks rise occasionally, but without urgency. They disappear into the dark ceiling like brief thoughts that do not need to be remembered. A nearby group has shifted closer together without any discussion. Their chairs form a tighter cluster than before. No one comments on the change, yet it feels intentional in a way that does not require explanation. Bodies naturally seek warmth, both physical and social, when external conditions remain unstable. A lesser-known detail preserved in coastal accounts suggests that during long winter storms, harbour inns often developed what could be described as layered schedules, not formal timetables, but informal patterns where eating, resting, storytelling, and small exchanges of goods occurred in repeating cycles. These cycles were not enforced. Yet they emerge naturally from necessity and shared experience. You become aware of how predictable unpredictability can be. Even without clocks or formal structure, the room still organizes itself into recognizable phases. Earlier intensity has given way to a quieter continuity from somewhere deeper in the inn. A soft sound of movement reaches you, a door opening briefly, then closing again, a muted exchange of words. Perhaps someone moving between storage and common space, and it blends into the background without disrupting the overall calm. A curious belief recorded in maritime storytelling traditions describes harbour inns as places where time itself becomes thicker during storms. The idea suggests that hours feel longer, not because they are extended, but because fewer distinct events divide them. While clearly symbolic, it captures something recognizable in the way your perception shifts here. You take in a slow breath, noticing how your body has adjusted to the environment. The earlier sharpness of awareness has softened. Even the sound of wood creaking above and below you feels less like interruption and more like continuity. A man across the room quietly finishes his drink and sets the cup down with deliberate care. The motion is small, but it seems to mark the end of something. Not a conversation, not a task, but a phase. He sits still afterward, hands resting loosely, gaze unfocused. One well-documented aspect of coastal trade towns was how inns became transitional spaces not only for goods and travellers, but also for states of mind. People arriving from long journeys often entered in a condition of alertness and gradually shifted into restfulness over time, influenced by warmth, food, and communal rhythm. The inn facilitated this transition almost unconsciously. You notice a similar process unfolding around you. Movements are fewer, conversation shorter, pauses longer, even laughter, when it appears, is brief and quickly absorbed back into silence. A server passes again, but now with less urgency than before. Their steps are measured, almost ritualized in their repetition. They collect empty bowls and cups, stacking them with quiet efficiency. No one interrupts them, no one calls attention to the process. It is simply part of the room's ongoing maintenance. A quirky detail preserved in coastal folklore tells of inns where the fire was believed to decide when storytelling would begin. In reality, this likely reflects how communal attention naturally shifts towards shared narratives once physical needs like eating have been met and the environment becomes stable enough for listening. Still, the metaphor captures how storytelling often emerged spontaneously rather than by plan. You glance toward the hearth again. The fire remains central, but it no longer dominates perception in the same way. It is now part of a wider field of calm around it. People sit in varying degrees of stillness, some engaged in quiet conversation, others simply watching the flames. A small group begins speaking more softly, their voices blending into the general hum rather than standing apart from it. Their discussion seems less about exchange and more about reflection. You catch fragments, but they do not form a single coherent thread. Outside, the storm persists, though its presence feels further removed now. The inn has absorbed so much of its pressure that it no longer feels like an external force pressing inward. Instead, it exists as a distant condition, acknowledged but not disruptive. Some interpretations of medieval coastal social behaviour suggest that inns functioned as emotional regulators during prolonged isolation caused by weather. Others emphasise economic necessity over psychological effect. Both perspectives intersect here. Where physical shelter and social adaptation are indistinguishable, you shift slightly, feeling the bench beneath you support your weight without resistance. The wood has become familiar now, its texture no longer noticeable in detail but understood through contact. A man near the fire leans forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His posture suggests a transition toward rest without fully entering it. Around him, others mirror similar states of partial withdrawal. The room is not asleep, but it is no longer fully awake. You realize that no single moment marks this transition. It unfolds gradually, through small reductions in activity, subtle changes in tone, and increasing stillness between interactions. The innkeeper is visible again, though now standing more still than before. Their gaze moves across the room with steady attention, not checking for problems, but observing continuity. Everything appears to be functioning within expected rhythm. A faint draft passes through the room, but it is weaker now. The walls no longer respond as sharply to the storm outside, or perhaps you're simply less sensitive to it. Either way, the boundary between inside and outside feels more stable. A lesser-known observation from maritime records describes how experienced travellers often judge the stability of harbour inns during storms not by noise, but by consistency. A stable inn was not silent, but predictably noisy. Its sounds remained familiar even under pressure, which provided reassurance. You find yourself within that predictability now. The fire continues its steady movement. Conversations remain soft. The room holds its shape without strain, and slowly, without announcement, the night continues its descent toward deeper quiet. The inn has settled into a deeper kind of stillness now. Not silence, but a softened continuity where every sound feels stretched and rounded at the edges. The fire no longer dominates the room. It simply exists, steady and patient, like a heartbeat that has learned not to rush. You notice how conversations have become sparse, replaced more often by pauses that no one feels the need to fill. People sit with their thoughts rather than their words. Even movement feels reduced to necessity. A hand adjusting a sleeve, a chair shifting slightly, a cup lifted and set down without urgency. The storm outside is still present, but it feels distant in a way that is difficult to define, not weaker, but less immediate, as if the inn has thickened its boundaries through repetition and endurance. The wind presses, but it no longer demands attention in the quieter state. Your awareness begins to drift toward the smaller details of the room, things that were always present but now feel more pronounced simply because everything else has slowed. The grain of the wooden beams above you, the uneven way smoke gathers near the ceiling before thinning out toward invisible gaps, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the hearth, bending the air in subtle distortions. These things become almost meditative when nothing else interrupts them. A man near the fire shifts his posture and rests his head back against the wall. His eyes remain open, but unfocused, not asleep, not fully awake. Around him, others are in similar states, suspended between alertness and rest. It is a shared condition, unspoken but widely understood. You take in a slow breath and notice how the air itself feels layered. Warm near the fire, cooler near the edges, and somewhere in between, a balance that holds everything together. The inn is no longer just a structure. It is a gradient of temperature, sound, and presence. In coastal trading towns of the medieval period, nights like this were not unusual during winter seasons when storms stalled maritime movement. Entire communities would pause in place, waiting for weather to shift before travel could resume. Inns became extended shelters of time, where days blurred together and activity adapted to uncertainty rather than schedule. You glance towards a nearby table where a small group sits in near silence. One of them traces a pattern on the wooden surface with a fingertip, slowly and without apparent purpose. Another watches the fire without blinking. Their stillness is not emptiness, it is attention without direction. A faint sound emerges from somewhere deeper in the building. A stair creaking under movement. A door opening briefly and closing again. These sounds feel more distinct now precisely because everything else has quieted. They travel farther in perception even if they remain physically small. A sailor near the edge of the room adjusts his position and exhales through his nose, a long, controlled breath that suggests both fatigue and acceptance. His clothing still carries traces of salt and damp wool. evidence of journeys that are temporarily suspended but not forgotten. You notice how the innkeeper moves less frequently now, but with the same steady awareness. Their presence is not intrusive, but it anchors the room. Occasionally they glance toward the fire, then toward the door, then back across the room, as if tracking multiple layers of condition at once without needing to intervene. Something subtle is happening in the way people occupy space. Chairs are no longer arranged for conversation. They are arranged for comfort. Bodies lean into walls, tables, and benches rather than toward each other. The social energy of earlier hours has transformed into something more internal. In maritime communities of Northern Europe, winter storms often created conditions where entire populations shared prolonged indoor periods. These intervals shape not only economic rhythms, but also patterns of storytelling, craftwork, and rest. Life adapted to enclosure rather than movement. A small bowl is lifted from a table and placed aside. No one speaks during the action. It is simply part of winding down. The fire pops once, sending a brief scattering of sparks upward before they vanish into the darkness above. You find yourself more aware of breath than before, not in a forced way, but as part of the environment. The rhythm of inhaling and exhaling seems to align with the slow pulse of the room. A faint conversation begins near the fire, but it never fully develops. One voice speaks, another responds softly, and then both fall back into silence. It feels less like interruption and more like testing the space between words. Along one wall, a traveller pulls their cloak tighter around their shoulders and shifts into a more reclined position. Their eyes close briefly, then open again. This cycle repeats without commitment, as if rest is approaching gradually rather than arriving all at once. In certain coastal traditions preserved through oral storytelling, inns were sometimes described as places where storms could not find their rhythm. The idea suggests that once inside, external chaos loses its structure and becomes fragmented into background sensation. While clearly metaphorical, it reflects how sheltered environments reshape perception of ongoing weather. You glance toward the window, though it reveals little beyond darkness and the suggestion of movement outside. The storm remains, but it no longer feels like something pressing against you personally. It has become a distant condition that exists beyond the thickness of the walls. A group near the centre of the room shifts slightly closer together, not out of conversation, but out of shared warmth. This clustering happens without instruction, guided by instinct more than decision. You notice how the firelight changes expression across faces. It smooths edges, softens lines, and turns fatigue into something less sharp. The same person can appear alert one moment and distant the next, simply depending on how the flame flickers. A faint smell of extinguished embers begins to mix with the air, suggesting that smaller fires or candles elsewhere in the inn are being reduced or adjusted. The room is slowly transitioning toward lower energy. There is a moment where everything feels suspended, not frozen, but balanced, as if the inn is holding its current state carefully before allowing it to shift further. Then it continues, not abruptly, but with quiet inevitability. The room remains awake, but it is no longer actively awake. It is resting in place, and you remain within it, carried gently by its slow descent into stillness. The inn continues its slow transformation, but this time the change is almost invisible unless you are paying close attention. The fire is still alive, yet it no longer demands the room's focus. Its light feels steadier, less performative, as if it has moved from center stage into a supporting role. Around you, people are no longer arranged around conversation, they are arranged around rest. Bodies lean into walls, benches, and table edges with increasing trust in their stability. Movement has not stopped, but it has become economical, reduced to only what is necessary to adjust comfort or settle fatigue. You notice how the soundscape has shifted again. Earlier layers of speech and activity have thinned into scattered fragments. Now even those fragments are rare. What remains is the persistent language of the building itself, the slow settling of wood, the occasional shift of weight across floorboards, the distant pulse of wind pressing against outer walls. Inside medieval harbour inns during long winter storms, this stage of the night often marked a shift from social exchange to quiet maintenance. People did not necessarily sleep immediately. Instead, they entered a transitional state where rest was approached gradually, shaped by environment rather than intention. You adjust your position slightly, feeling the bench respond with a soft, familiar creak. Even that sound feels softer now, absorbed into the general calm. Your awareness is less divided. Instead of tracking multiple conversations or movements, you find yourself noticing singular impressions. Heat against your sleeve, the faint smell of smoke clinging to fabric, the slow rhythm of breathing in nearby seats. A man across the room shifts and lets his head rest fully against the wall. His posture changes the atmosphere around him more than any sound could. Others nearby follow similar patterns without coordination. This is not imitation, it is convergence. A small cluster near the fire has stopped speaking entirely. Their attention is no longer directed outward. One of them keeps their hands folded loosely in their lap. Another rests their forearms on the table, head slightly bowed. These positions suggest neither urgency nor engagement, but a suspension between wakefulness and sleep. In coastal settlements influenced by maritime trade networks, inns often functioned as extended resting environments during prolonged weather disruptions. Travellers could remain for multiple days depending on storm duration, creating conditions where social and biological rhythms adapted to enclosed space. The result was a gradual synchronization of rest cycles across groups of unrelated individuals. You feel this synchronization subtly around you. The room is no longer composed of separate activities. It's becoming a single shared condition. The fire shifts again, but gently this time. A log settles deeper into the embers, producing a low, almost comforting sound. The light dims slightly, then stabilizes. Shadows respond by softening rather than shifting dramatically. Even darkness here feels moderated. A faint draft moves through the room, but it is weaker than earlier in the night. It passes through without disturbing the overall balance. You notice how few people react to it now, earlier. Such a movement would have caused subtle adjustments. Now it is simply absorbed. A lesser-known observation from maritime communities suggests that prolonged storm nights inside harbour inns often produced a kind of collective quiet that was not planned, but emerged naturally from shared environmental pressure. As external conditions stabilized into predictability, internal behavior followed suit, reducing variability in sound and movement. You glance toward the counter. The innkeeper is present but less active now. Their movements are slower, more spaced out, as if even management has entered a reduced state. They still observe the room, but there is less need for intervention. Everything appears to be functioning within expected limits. You notice how attention itself has changed. Earlier, it was outward and scanning. Now it is inward and diffused. Even when you look at specific details, your mind does not hold on to them for long. They pass through perception rather than anchoring it. A traveller near the far wall adjusts their cloak and then remains still for a long moment. Their breathing is visible in the slight rise and fall of their shoulders. Around them, others are in similar states. The room resembles a landscape of quiet, intermittent motion. In some coastal oral traditions, inns during storm nights were described as places where people borrow stillness from each other. This reflects the way shared environments influence rest patterns, even without direct communication. The idea is metaphorical, but it captures the observable tendency for groups to settle together into similar rhythms. You find yourself leaning slightly deeper into your seat without consciously deciding to do so. The wood supports you without resistance. Its texture is no longer something you actively notice, but something you trust implicitly. A faint sound of shifting crockery emerges from somewhere behind the counter, likely the clearing of remaining items or preparation for reduced activity. It is not disruptive. It simply exists as part of the room's final layers of movement. The fire emits a small, steady crackle. No bursts, no flares, just continuity. It feels less like a source of energy now, and more like a presence maintaining balance. A group that had been speaking earlier has fully fallen silent. Their heads are angled downward or resting back. No one is fully asleep, but no one is actively engaged either. This shared stillness feels natural, not imposed. Some interpretations of medieval coastal life suggest that inns acted as intermediate states between active travel and full rest, especially during winter storms when movement was impossible. Others emphasize economic necessity over behavioral effect, regardless of interpretation. The lived experience appears consistent across many surviving descriptions of prolonged storm sheltering. You exhale slowly, noticing how the breath feels less like action and more like continuation. The room around you has become a stable field of quiet presence. Nothing demands attention, nothing interrupts it. Outside, the storm still exists, but it feels distant enough now that it no longer defines the atmosphere. The inn has fully established its internal equilibrium, and within that equilibrium, time continues at a softer pace. The inn has settled into a near whisper state now, where even movement feels optional rather than expected. The fire continues its quiet labour, but its dominance has faded into something gentler. It no longer pulls attention, it simply sustains presence. You remain seated, and the sensation of time becomes increasingly indistinct. Not absent, but softened, as if each passing moment has been wrapped in cloth before it reaches you. The room is still occupied, still alive, yet its energy has shifted into a lower register. Around you, bodies are no longer oriented toward interaction. They are oriented toward endurance and rest. Heads lean against beams, shoulders relax into benches, hands rest loosely where they fall. The architecture of the room now supports people more than they participate in it. One widely observed feature of long winter nights in medieval harbour inns was this gradual compression of activity into stillness. When storms delayed departure from ports, entire communities could remain indoors for extended periods, and the inn became a shared resting environment where social life paused without fully disappearing. It was not sleep alone that defined. But the slow fading of outward behaviour, you notice how even breathing seems more visible now, not because it has changed, but because everything else has receded. The subtle rise and fall of shoulders becomes one of the few remaining forms of motion. A man near the fire has fully leaned back now, head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes are closed. But his posture suggests he is not fully unconscious. Nearby, another traveller mirrors a similar position, though facing a different direction. These small variations create a quiet pattern of rest distributed across the room. A faint sound emerges from the structure itself, not wind this time, but settling wood, a slow adjustment of pressure through beams that have carried weight all day and night. In medieval coastal architecture, especially in timber-heavy constructions near harbours, buildings often responded to humidity and wind shifts with audible internal movement. These sounds were rarely considered alarming. Instead, they became part of the expected nighttime environment. You shift slightly, and the bench responds with a muted creak. It is softer than earlier in the evening, as if even the wood has entered a quieter state. The sound does not interrupt anything, it simply joins the background. A small group near the counter has stopped speaking entirely. One of them has folded their arms and bowed their head. Another sits upright but motionless, gaze unfocused. The third rests a hand near an empty bowl without interacting with it. Their silence is not coordinated, but it is shared. A lesser-known detail preserved in coastal oral tradition describes how storm-bound inns often developed what could be called layered quiet, where silence was not absolute but accumulated in stages. First conversation faded, then movement reduced. Finally, even gestures became minimal, leaving only environmental sound and occasional structural noise. You can feel those layers now. The room is not silent, but it is stripped of excess. The fire shifts again, but only slightly. A small adjustment in the logs causes a brief flicker of light across the floor. Shadows respond gently to the stretching and then settling back into place. There is no urgency in the movement. Everything seems to operate at reduced intensity. You notice how your own body has adapted without instruction. Shoulders lowered, breathing slow, attention no longer scanning widely, but resting in short intervals on nearby objects. The edge of a table, the curve of a beam, the faint glow of embers. In coastal communities influenced by maritime trade routes, inns often became places where entire groups of strangers synchronized their rest patterns during extended weather delays. This was not organized but emergent. Shared environment and shared constraint produce similar behavior across unrelated individuals. A faint sound of shifting fabric draws your attention briefly. Someone adjusts their cloak and then remains still again. The motion is small enough to disappear quickly into the surrounding quiet. You glance toward the door. It remains closed, but it feels less significant now. Earlier in the night it represented pressure and uncertainty. Now it is simply part of the structure. Like any other boundary that holds the space together, the innkeeper is still present near the counter, but their movements are minimal. They stand for longer periods without shifting position, observing the room in a way that suggests maintenance of atmosphere rather than active management. Occasionally they glance toward the fire, then toward the room, then return to stillness. A curious belief preserved in maritime storytelling suggests that harbour inns at night would sometimes hold their breath during storms, as if the building itself participated in the shared quiet of its occupants. While metaphorical, it reflects the way people interpreted the alignment between environmental stillness and human rest. You exhale slowly, noticing how the air feels warmer than before, not in temperature alone, but in density. It carries less movement, more continuity. A man near the edge of the room shifts slightly, then stops. The adjustment does not lead to further action, it simply resolves into stillness. Around him, similar micro-movements occur and then dissolve. The fire emits a soft crackle, barely noticeable unless you are listening for it. It remains the only consistent source of motion in the room, yet even it feels subdued, as if conserving itself. Some interpretations of medieval coastal life suggest that inns during prolonged storms acted as transitional environments where the boundaries between activity and rest became indistinct. Others emphasize practical necessity, noting that reduced movement conserved heat and energy during periods of isolation. Both perspectives align with what you observe here. The room no longer feels like a place of gathering. It feels like a shared condition of waiting without urgency. A faint draft moves through the upper edges of the space, but it does not disturb anything. It passes through like a memory of wind rather than wind itself. You notice how little distinction remains between individual actions. Each person exists within their own stillness. Yet those stillnesses resemble one another closely enough that they form a collective pattern. The inn has entered a phase where nothing new is being introduced, only continuation remains. And within that continuation, the night deepens further, without resistance or interruption. The inn is no longer in its earlier state of shared activity, or even shared quiet. It has shifted into something softer still, a condition where presence itself feels diluted, stretched thin across the room like warm air that refuses to leave. The fire remains, but it no longer commands attention, it simply continues, steady and unremarkable, as though it has always been doing exactly this and always will. You remain seated, Though the sense of sitting has begun to lose sharp definition, your awareness drifts in gentle arcs, no longer anchored to any single point. The room around you is still populated, but the people within it feel less like individuals and more like variations of the same slow state of rest. Heads are bowed now in different degrees. Some rest fully against walls or beams, others lean forward with arms folded, breathing slow and even. A few remain upright but motionless, their stillness so complete it becomes indistinguishable from sleep unless you look closely. A faint sense of rhythm emerges, not from conversation or movement, but from breathing itself. It is not synchronized in any formal way, yet it begins to feel cohesive. In enclosed environments during long winter storms, especially in medieval harbour inns, such subtle alignment of rest was a common outcome of prolonged shared enclosure. Without external stimulation or travel, bodies naturally adjusted to a slower collective tempo. You notice how the firelight now behaves differently. It no longer seems to animate the room. Instead, it gently reveals what is already still. Shadows are softer, less dramatic. Edges of objects blur slightly as if the room itself is becoming less interested in definition. A man near the centre of the room shifts once, then does not move again. The adjustment is small, but it feels final in a way that earlier movements did not. Around him, others remain in similar states of settled immobility. No one is fully unconscious, yet no one is actively engaged either. You become aware of how sound has thinned further. What remains is mostly environmental. The faint crackle of embers, the distant muted pressure of wind against outer walls, occasional settling of wood that travels through beams like slow exhalations from the structure itself. In medieval coastal towns, inns often functioned as extended nighttime shelters during storms that prevented maritime travel. These conditions led to prolonged indoor occupancy, where the distinction between evening, night, and early morning became less meaningful. Time was measured less by hours and more by changes in light, warmth, and human fatigue. You lean slightly back into the bench, feeling its support more fully than before. The wood beneath you is warm from earlier use and retains that warmth without effort. It no longer feels like an object. It feels like part of the environment holding you in place. A faint movement near the counter draws your attention briefly. The innkeeper is still present, but their posture is more static now. They stand in a way that suggests observation without intervention. Their role has become almost entirely passive, as if ensuring continuity rather than managing change. A small cluster of travellers near the fire remains partially awake. Though their engagement is minimal, one has their head tilted slightly downward, eyes closed but not fully asleep. Another sits with hands loosely folded, gaze unfocused. A third appears to be watching the fire, though their attention seems distant, as if directed inward rather than outward. A subtle observation from maritime communities suggests that inns during long storms often entered a phase where human presence and building presence felt indistinguishable in rhythm. The structure, the fire, and the occupants all contributed to a single shared condition of stillness that emerged gradually rather than being imposed. You notice this convergence now in a way that feels almost physical. The room is not divided into separate elements anymore. It is a continuous field of warmth, dim light, and reduced motion. The fire shifts slightly as another log settles deeper into embers. The sound is soft, almost comforting. A brief flicker of light passes across nearby faces, then fades. Even this change feels gentle, absorbed quickly into the overall calm. A traveller near the edge of the room adjusts their cloak, then becomes still again. The motion is so small it barely registers. It disappears into the larger stillness without disruption. In some coastal oral traditions, inns during storm nights were described as places where rest gathers in layers. This imagery reflects how people often entered sleep gradually, passing through stages of quiet wakefulness before fully resting. While symbolic, it captures the observable progression of behavior in such environments. You feel yourself moving along that same gradient, not asleep, not fully awake, but suspended in a state where thought becomes less structured. Ideas arise without urgency and fade without resistance. The sound of the storm outside is now faint enough to feel almost imagined. It is present, but distant. Filtered through layers of timber and heat, it no longer defines the space. It simply exists beyond it. A faint scent of ash and extinguished wood begins to replace earlier aromas of food and spice. The room has transitioned from nourishment to endurance, from activity to continuation. You notice how little distinction there is now between those who are awake and those who are resting. The difference is mostly posture, functionally. Everyone is in a similar state of reduced inhibition. Some interpretations of coastal life suggest that inns during extended storms acted as environments where social boundaries softened into shared physical conditions. Others focus more on environmental necessity, noting that reduced mobility naturally led to collective rest patterns. In either view, the result is a space where individual behavior merges into group rhythm without explicit coordination. You exhale slowly, and the breath feels longer than expected. Not because it is, but because perception has slowed to match the environment. The fire continues its quiet persistence. The room continues its quiet holding. The night continues its gradual unfolding, and within it, everything rests without fully ending. The inn has entered a deeper stillness now, one that feels less like a transition and more like a settled condition. The fire remains, but even it seems to have adjusted to the rhythm of the room, burning lower, steadier. Its movements reduced to quiet persistence rather than display. The light it casts is softer, spreading across surfaces without urgency, as if it no longer needs to announce its presence. You remain seated, and the boundary between awareness and rest continues to thin. It is not a sudden shift, but a gradual easing, like the loosening of tension that had been held for longer than you realized. The room around you still exists in detail, but those details no longer demand attention in the same way. Figures nearby are now mostly still. Some have fully surrendered to sleep, heads resting against wood or cloth or folded arms. Others linger in that uncertain middle state where eyes are closed, but consciousness has not fully released its grip. The overall impression is one of quiet suspension, as if the entire room has paused without needing instruction. The fire's sound is minimal now. Occasional soft pops from settling embers, a slow exhale of the heat. The ceiling above absorbs the rising smoke in dim layers that no longer feel oppressive, only familiar. Even the smell of ash has softened into something almost neutral, woven into the background of the space. In medieval harbour inns during long winter storms, nights often reached this phase after hours of confinement, with no arrivals or departures, and no movement to or from the docks. The building would become an enclosed ecosystem of rest. People adapted to this enforced stillness in ways that blurred the distinction between individual sleep and collective quiet. You notice how your own perception has narrowed, not in restriction, but in simplicity. Fewer things stand out. Fewer things demand interpretation. The grain of wood nearby, the faint outline of a table edge, the distant suggestion of movement that may or may not be real. A soft shift occurs somewhere near the counter, though it is barely perceptible. The innkeeper moves, or perhaps only adjusts posture. Even this minimal activity feels distant, as if belonging to another layer of time. Their presence remains, but it no longer organizes the room in any visible way. Everything has already been set into its resting state. A faint draught passes through the upper edges of the room, but it does not disturb the calm. It is absorbed almost immediately, losing definition as it moves inward. The building no longer reacts sharply to external pressure. It simply accommodates it. One well-documented aspect of prolonged storm nights in coastal settlements was the gradual equalization of activity levels in side enclosed spaces when external conditions prevented travel. Inns often became places where rest, waiting, and inactivity merged into a shared condition. Over time, distinctions between individuals softened, replaced by collective stillness shaped by the environment rather than choice. You feel this softening now in a way that is difficult to describe precisely. It is not disappearance of awareness, but reduction of separation. The room is still composed of many elements, yet they no longer feel isolated from one another. The fire shifts slightly again. A log settles deeper into embers, producing a sound so faint it almost blends with silence. The glow changes in response, dimming and then stabilizing. Shadows adjust without drama, as if they too are conserving energy. A traveller near the far wall shifts once, then becomes still again. The motion is brief enough to feel like part of the room's breathing rather than an individual action. Around them, others remain in similar states of quiet repose. In some maritime oral traditions, inns during storm confinement were described as spaces where sleep arrives in stages rather than moments. This reflects the gradual transition from wakefulness to rest observed in such environments. People did not simply fall asleep. They eased into it through layers of reduced activity and sensory engagement. You notice that same layering now. Thought becomes less structured. Attention no longer moves in clear direction but drifts gently between impressions. The sensation is not of losing awareness, but of letting it loosen. The sound of the storm outside is now faint, almost indistinguishable from the inn's own structural noise. Wind against timber, distant pressure, and internal settling merge into a single continuous background. The boundary between inside and outside feels less relevant. A subtle change in air temperature occurs as embers settle further. The room remains warm, but less intensely so. It is a stable warmth now, not radiant, but sustained. People respond to it without conscious thought, adjusting slightly in their sleep or rest positions. You become aware of your own stillness in a more complete way, not as an action, but as a condition that has formed around you. There is no urge to move, no expectation of change, only continuation. A faint memory of earlier activity still exists in the structure of the room, the arrangement of tables, the faint traces of conversation, the residual warmth of shared meals. These elements remain present, but they no longer animate the space. They have become part of its texture. Some interpretations of coastal communal life suggest that inns during prolonged storms acted as environments where human rhythms adapted fully to environmental constraint. Others emphasize the resilience of social structures, even in reduced conditions. Both perspectives align in the observation that behavior here becomes increasingly unified by stillness rather than action. The fire emits another soft sound, almost imperceptible. It feels like the final stain of continuous burning rather than active change. Its presence remains central, but no longer dominant. You find that even observation itself requires less effort now. Things simply register and pass without analysis. The room is no longer something you are interpreting. It is something you are within. A final layer of quiet settles across the space. Not absolute silence, but a complete reduction of unnecessary sound. What remains is essential and minimal. The inn holds its shape. The storm continues outside, and between them, everything rests in a shared stillness that does not need to be maintained, only experienced. The stillness that has settled over the inn is no longer something that feels like it might change soon. It has become the dominant condition of the space, as if the building itself has entered a long, steady exhale that will not be interrupted until morning. The fire remains present, but it has reduced itself to a quiet core of glowing embers, no longer casting sharp movement across the room, only a gentle, steady warmth that spreads evenly in all directions. You remain where you are, though the sense of positioning has softened. The bench beneath you is no longer an object you are sitting on so much as a surface that holds you in place. Your awareness moves in slow, unfocused intervals, no longer seeking detail but simply registering presence around you. The room is almost entirely still. Figures are now fully settled into rest. Some lie across benches with cloaks drawn close as others sit upright but motionless, heads bowed and breathing slow enough to blend into the ambient rhythm of the inn. The distinction between sleep and deep rest has become difficult to define. Everything has flattened into a shared state of reduced motion. The soundscape is minimal. The fire occasionally shifts with a soft crack or faint collapse of embers. The wood of the building responds in distant, gentle creaks that feel more like memory than sound. Even the storm outside, which earlier in the night pressed so insistently against the structure, now feels distant and diluted, as if it has been absorbed into layers of timber and time. In coastal harbour settlements during prolonged winter storms, such nights were often described in surviving accounts as periods where entire communities entered synchronized stillness, with ships anchored and trade suspended. Inns became extended shelters where activity slowed to near standstill, not through planning but through environmental necessity. The result was a shared quiet that extended across unrelated individuals. You feel that shared condition now, not as something observed, but as something inhabited. The room no longer feels divided into separate presences. It feels continuous, as if all movement has dissolved into a single, unified state of rest. A faint shift occurs near the fire as one ember collapses inward. The glow dims slightly, then stabilizes again. The change is so small it barely registers. Yet in this quiet it feels meaningful, like a subtle adjustment in the room's overall breathing pattern. Nearby, a traveller shifts position once, then becomes still again. The movement is slow, unintentional, and immediately absorbed back into silence around them. Others remain unchanged. The room does not react to individual motion anymore. It simply continues. One widely observed feature of long storm nights in medieval port inns was the way human activity gradually synchronized with environmental stillness. As external conditions reduced mobility, internal behavior followed suit, eventually reaching a point where individual variation diminished. What remained was a collective pattern of rest shaped by repetition and shared circumstance. You notice this synchronization not as a concept but as a sensation. Everything feels aligned in its reduction. Breathing, light, sound, even thought itself seems to follow the same slow rhythm, expanding and contracting without urgency. The fire emits another faint sound, almost indistinguishable from the settling of wood. Its light is now so soft that it no longer creates strong contrast. Shadows exist, but they are shallow and diffuse, no longer stretching or shifting dramatically across surfaces. You become aware of your own breathing more clearly, not because it has changed, but because everything else has faded into similar quiet. It no longer feels like an action, it feels like continuation. In some maritime traditions preserved through oral storytelling, inns during storm confinement were described as places where the night becomes layered rather than divided. This imagery reflects how time loses clear segmentation under conditions of prolonged stillness. Without external markers of change, the night becomes a continuous state rather than a sequence of events. You experience that continuity now. There is no clear sense of progression, only persistence. A faint draft moves through the upper structure of the inn, but it is barely perceptible. It passes through without disturbing anything, absorbed into the general stability of the room. Even the building's response to wind has softened. Earlier creaks and adjustments have reduced to occasional, distant sounds that no longer draw attention. A small group near the fire remains in partial wakefulness, though even they show little movement. Their silhouettes are still, their outlines softened by low light. No conversation emerges, no gestures interrupt the quiet. they simply remain present within it. Some interpretations of medieval coastal life suggest that inns during extended storms functioned as environments where human behavior adapted fully to environmental constraint, eventually reaching equilibrium with external conditions. Others emphasize the endurance of individual routines even within collective stillness. Both perspectives are visible here, though neither dominates. The fire settles further, its glow now reduced to a steady, low presence. It no longer changes the room in visible ways, it simply maintains warmth. Its role has shifted entirely from active source to quiet support. You feel the bench beneath you more as support than object. The texture is no longer something you notice in detail. It has become part of the background of sensation, as familiar as the air around you. A faint sense of distance begins to emerge between thought and observation. Ideas arise without structure, then dissolve before forming into anything concrete. The mind no longer organizes experience actively. It receives it and releases it without resistance. In coastal inns during prolonged weather confinement, this stage of night was often marked by near total reduction in social interaction. Even those who remained awake did so in shen or near silence, conserving energy and maintaining warmth. The environment encouraged stillness not through instruction, but through accumulation of conditions. You notice how natural that stillness feels now. It does not require effort, it simply exists. The room holds its shape with remarkable consistency. No new movements occur that alter its balance. No sounds emerge that disrupt its calm. Even the fire's presence feels integrated rather than central. Outside, the storm remains, but it has fully receded from perception. It is no longer something pressing against the walls. It is something distant, filtered through layers of structure and rest. You remain within this condition, neither moving towards sleep nor resisting it, only continuing gently within the settled quiet of the inn. The inn remains in its deepest quiet now, a stillness so complete it feels less like absence of sound and more like sound having been softened into permanence. The fire still lives, but only just. A low bed of embers that glow faintly beneath ash and charcoal, providing warmth without movement, presence without expression. You are still seated. Though the sense of sitting has become indistinct, your body feels fully supported, as if the bench, the floor, and the surrounding air have all agreed to share the task of holding you in place. There is no urgency anywhere in the room, no demand for attention, no expectation of response. All around you, figures are settled into rest. Some lie stretched across benches or makeshift bedding, cloaks drawn tightly around shoulders. Others remain upright but motionless, heads bowed, breathing so slow it blends into the background of the room. The distinction between sleep and wakefulness has nearly disappeared. What remains is a shared condition of suspension. The fire emits only occasional movement now, a faint collapse of embers, a soft shift of heat. Even these changes feel absorbed quickly into the stillness, leaving no trace of disruption. The light it casts is minimal, a dull amber presence that barely reaches the edges of the room. In coastal harbour inns during long winter storms, nights often reached this stage after many hours of confinement, with no ships arriving or departing and no movement possible beyond the harbour. Entire buildings would settle into extended quiet. People remained indoors not only out of necessity but because the environment itself encouraged stillness. The inn became less a place of activity and more a shared state of waiting transformed into rest. You notice how your awareness has narrowed further. Not sharply, but gently. Fewer details stand out. Those that do appear without effort and fade just as easily. The grain of wood near your hand, the faint outline of a table edge. The soft rise and fall of breath nearby that blends with your own without clear separation. A faint movement occurs somewhere near the counter. but it is too subtle to register as a distinct action. The innkeeper is still present. Though their role has diminished into near invisibility, they remain part of the room's structure, observing without intervention, ensuring continuity without disruption. The fire shifts slightly again, but there is no change in atmosphere. The room does not react, it simply continues. Shadows remain stable, no longer stretching or contracting with any urgency. Even light feels reduced to its most essential form. A traveller near the far wall adjusts their position once, then becomes still again. The motion is so small it feels like part of the room's natural settling rather than an individual action. Around them, others remain unchanged, absorbed into the same still condition. In some maritime accounts preserved through coastal oral traditions, inns during storm confinement were described as spaces where night loses its edges. This phrase reflects how time becomes less segmented when external conditions prevent movement or change. Without distinct events to mark progression, hours merge into a continuous, unbroken experience. You feel that merging now. There is no sense of beginning or end to the current moment, only continuation. The soundscape is almost entirely reduced to environmental presence. The faintest crackle from embers, the distant muted pressure of wind against timber, occasional settling of the structure that travels through beams like slow, deliberate breathing. These sounds no longer interrupt silence, they define it. A small group near the fire remains in partial awareness, though even they show no active engagement. Their postures are relaxed, their movements absent. They exist within the room rather than interacting with it. One interpretation of medieval coastal life suggests that inns during prolonged storms functioned as environments where human rhythms gradually aligned with environmental stillness, producing a shared state of reduced activity across unrelated individuals. Another view emphasizes the practical necessity of conserving energy during confinement, with rest emerging as a natural outcome rather than a social phenomenon. Both perspectives converge here in observable form. You notice how even thought has slowed, not stopped, but softened. Ideas form without structure and dissolve before they take shape. Attention no longer seeks direction. It simply rests where it happens to be. The fire emits another faint adjustment, but it is barely perceptible. The glow remains steady, low, and constant. It no longer marks time or change, it simply sustains warmth. A faint draft moves through the upper reaches of the room, but it does not disturb anything. It passes through without resistance. Absorbed into the general stillness, the building no longer reacts visibly to external pressure. It accommodates it silently. In coastal inns, influenced by maritime trade routes, extended storm nights often produced conditions where entire groups of travellers entered synchronized rest cycles, without external schedules. Sleep and wakefulness became governed by shared environment rather than individual choice. The result was a collective rhythm shaped by containment rather than coordination. You experience this lack of distinction now. There is no clear separation between active rest and passive awareness. Everything exists within a single continuous state. A faint shift of fabric occurs nearby as someone adjusts their cloak and then becomes still again. The movement is so small it disappears almost immediately into the surrounding quiet. The fire continues its minimal presence. No flare, no collapse, only persistence. Its role has been reduced to maintaining a stable core of warmth within an otherwise motionless environment. You feel your own body in a similar way, not as something acting, but as something sustained. There is no effort in remaining still. Stillness has become the default condition. Some maritime storytelling traditions describe inns during storms as places where the night folds inward, suggesting a compression of time and activity into a single extended moment, while metaphorical. This image reflects the lived experience of prolonged indoor confinement, where external change is absent and internal variation becomes minimal. You remain within that folded state now. There is no push towards sleep, but there is no resistance to it either. Only continuation within quiet. The room holds steady. The fire holds steady. The storm outside, now fully distant in perception, holds steady beyond awareness. And everything within the inn continues without interruption, without division, without end. The inn holds its final state of the night in a silence that is no longer separate from anything else. It is not silence imposed, and not silence achieved. It is silence that has grown naturally from hours of reduction, settling into every beam, every stone, every breath within the space until it feels indistinguishable from the structure itself. The fire is now only embers, a low, steady glow beneath a thin layer of ash, providing warmth without movement, light without expression. It no longer marks time, it only continues to exist, as if refusing to fully disappear out of habit rather than purpose. You remain where you are, though the idea of remaining has softened. There is no longer a sense of position that requires awareness. The bench, the floor, and the surrounding air support you without distinction. Your body is not held in place so much as included in the stillness of the room. Every figure around you is settled. Some are fully asleep, their forms quiet and complete. Others linger in that final threshold where awareness has loosened, but not entirely released. A few remain upright, motionless, as if they have simply become part of the furniture of the night. Nothing moves with intention anymore. Everything exists in continuity. The storm outside is no longer felt as pressure. It is no longer even noise. It has dissolved into the background of memory, present only as a distant suggestion that there is a world beyond these walls. Inside, the inn no longer reacts to it. It does not resist or absorb, it simply continues in its own equilibrium. In coastal harbour, settlements shaped by long maritime winters, nights like this often marked the deepest point of enforced stillness, with no travel possible and no external demands. Entire communities would remain inside for extended periods, their routines dissolving into shared rest. The inn, in such conditions, became not just shelter but continuity itself, holding people in a suspended state between movement and absence. You notice how even perception has slowed to its simplest form. There is no search for detail, no effort to interpret. Things appear and fade without holding attention. The grain of wood near your hand, the faint outline of a beam above, the subtle gradient of dim light across surfaces, all of it exists without demand. The fire shifts once, a nearly imperceptible settling of embers. The glow adjusts slightly, then returns to stability. No one reacts. The room does not change in response, it simply remains. A faint sound of internal movement within the structure travels through the beams, not as interruption, but as continuity. The building breathes in its own way, responding to temperature and pressure in slow cycles that have become familiar over the course of the night. These sounds are no longer separate from silence, they define its texture. One interpretation of long storm confinement in medieval port environments suggests that inns functioned as spaces where human activity gradually aligned with environmental stillness, producing a shared condition in which distinction between individual rest and collective atmosphere diminished. Another perspective focuses on the practical inevitability of rest under sustained isolation, where reduced movement becomes the default response to environmental constraint. In either understanding, the result is the same as space where stillness becomes shared. You feel that shared condition fully now, not as observation, but as participation. The room is no longer something you are within as a separate observer. It is something you are part of, without separation or boundary. A faint movement occurs somewhere near the edge of the room, but it does not register as disruption. It is absorbed instantly into the overall quiet. Even if someone shifts, adjusts, or breathes more deeply, it does not alter the state of the space. Everything has reached a level of equilibrium where variation no longer creates change. The fire remains the only visible centre of life, but even it no longer feels central. It is simply a constant. Its embers glow without urgency, without expansion, without contraction. It provides warmth without drawing attention. You become aware of your own breathing in a way that feels less like process and more like presence. It no longer belongs to action, it belongs to continuation. There is no effort in it, no direction, in maritime oral traditions preserved across northern coastal regions. Inns during storm nights were sometimes described as places where time forgets its edges. This poetic framing reflects how extended enclosure without external markers of change creates a sense of continuity that lacks clear segmentation. Hours become indistinguishable from one another, not through distortion, but through lack of interruption. That continuity now fills everything. The room does not feel like it is moving toward morning or away from evening. It simply exists in a sustained state that does not require transition. There is no anticipation of change, only the quiet maintenance of what already is. A faint adjustment in fabric somewhere nearby suggests someone shifting deeper into rest. But even that movement feels like part of the same stillness. It does not stand apart from the environment, it belongs to it. The innkeeper is no longer distinctly noticeable. Their presence, once a subtle organising force, has blended into the background of the room. Nothing requires adjustment, nothing requires attention. The system has stabilised completely. Outside, the storm has ceased to matter in perception. Whether it continues or not is no longer part of the immediate experience. The inn contains all relevant reality within its walls. Beyond them, only distance remains. You feel the final reduction of tension leave the space, not as event, but as completion of process. Everything that needed to settle has settled. Everything that needed to slow has slowed. The fire continues. The room continues, the night continues, and within that continuity, nothing remains unfinished, only stillness, held without effort until it becomes indistinguishable from rest itself. Sweet dream!